The stagecoach wheels ground to a halt in the Montana dust, and Ethan Calloway's carefully planned future shattered with 5 words. "Adelaide isn't coming, Mr. Calloway." The woman who stepped down wasn't his mail-order bride. She was Clara Whitmore, auburn-haired and fierce-eyed, carrying enough fire in her voice to burn down everything he thought he wanted. In 30 seconds, she turned his quiet dream of marriage into something far more dangerous, a love worth fighting for. Stay with me, friends, as I tell you how a cowboy ready for silence found a woman who brought thunder, and comment below which town you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels tonight. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana territory as Ethan Calloway stood at the edge of Pine Creek's main thoroughfare, his weathered hands gripping the brim of his hat like it might blow away in the September wind. He'd been standing there for the better part of an hour, watching the horizon for the telltale dust cloud that would announce the arrival of the weekly stagecoach from Billings. His boots, polished to an unusual shine for a working rancher, shifted nervously in the dirt. Today wasn't just any day. Today was the day his bride would arrive, Adelaide Thornton. He rolled the name around in his mind like a smooth riverstone, trying to make it feel familiar. 6 months of letters had passed between them, each one carefully composed and properly distant, arranged through Reverend Morrison, who assured him that Miss Thornton was everything a frontier wife should be: quiet, dutiful, and skilled in all the domestic arts that would transform his ranch house from a bachelor's dwelling into a proper home. "She's a lamb of the Lord," the Reverend had said, his thin fingers steepled in satisfaction. "Raised in proper Christian virtue back in Philadelphia. She'll bring civilization to your homestead, Ethan. Mark my words." Ethan had nodded, paid the Reverend's fee for the correspondence arrangement, and set about preparing for Adelaide's arrival with the same methodical precision he brought to breeding cattle or breaking horses. He'd added a second room to the ranch house, complete with a proper window that looked out over the valley. He'd ordered fabric from the general store, soft blue cotton that the shopkeeper's wife assured him would make fine curtains. He'd even planted wildflowers along the porch, though half of them had already surrendered to the harsh Montana soil. "You're a fool, Calloway," his nearest neighbor, Jack Brennan, had told him just yesterday, leaning against the corral fence with a knowing smirk. "Mail-order brides are for desperate men and fools. Which one are you?" "Neither," Ethan had replied, though the word sat uneasily on his tongue. "I'm practical. A ranch needs a woman's touch, and Pine Creek isn't exactly overflowing with marriageable ladies." That was the truth of it. Pine Creek, for all its promise as a growing settlement, boasted exactly 3 unmarried women of appropriate age. The schoolteacher who'd made it clear she had no interest in ranch life, the saloon owner's daughter who had her sights set on heading east, and Widow Patterson, who was 20 years his senior and had already buried 3 husbands. The mathematics of frontier life were simple and unforgiving. The mathematical certainty he'd relied upon, however, hadn't accounted for the woman who would actually step off that stagecoach. The first sign of trouble was the dust cloud itself. Too small for a proper stagecoach, more like a single wagon moving fast. Ethan squinted, his hand shading his eyes against the morning glare. As the vehicle drew closer, he could make out old Sam Wheeler at the reins, his usually relaxed posture tense with urgency. The stage itself looked wrong too, listing slightly to one side, one of the doors hanging open and banging against the frame with each bump in the road. "Whoa there!" Sam called out as he pulled the horses to a stop in front of the stage depot. Sweat had carved rivers through the dust on his weathered face, and his eyes held the wild look of a man who'd seen trouble on the trail. "Had us some excitement about 10 miles back. Road agents tried their luck, but we gave them what for?" Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he rushed forward. Road agents meant violence, meant danger, meant Adelaide, his bride. Was she hurt? Frightened? He reached for the coach door just as movement inside caught his eye. The woman who emerged was nothing like the photograph he'd kept in his vest pocket for 3 months. Where Adelaide Thornton had been blonde and delicate-featured in her portrait, this woman had hair the color of autumn fire, twisted up in a style that had clearly suffered from the journey. Where Adelaide's expression had been serene and modest, this woman's green eyes blazed with a fury that could have melted iron. Where Adelaide had promised in her letters to be a quiet helpmate and gentle companion, This woman looked ready to take on the entire Montana territory with her bare hands. This is absolutely unacceptable. The woman's voice rang out like a church bell, clear and commanding. First, those ruffians cause us to overturn, scattering luggage across half of Montana, and now I'm told that my trunks with everything I own in this world, are somewhere back on that godforsaken trail? What kind of frontier operation is this? Sam Wheeler, who'd faced down bears and outlaws with equal calm, actually took a step backward. Now, miss, we did our best under the circumstances. Your best? She rounded on him, her skirt swirling with the force of her turn. Your best has left me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a letter that's probably blown halfway to Canada by now. It was then that her eyes found Ethan, and something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but refocused like a rifle finding its target. She looked him up and down with an assessment that made him acutely aware of every speck of dust on his Sunday clothes, every day of his 32 years that showed in the lines around his eyes. "You're Ethan Calloway," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am." His voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by confusion and something else, something that flickered to life the moment her green eyes met his. "And you're not Adelaide Thornton." A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "How perceptive. No, Mr. Calloway, I'm not Adelaide. I'm Clara Whitmore, her cousin, and I'm here to tell you that Adelaide isn't coming." The words hit him like a physical blow. Around them, the morning sounds of Pine Creek continued, horses neighing, hammers ringing from the blacksmith shop, the distant laughter of children. But for Ethan, the world had narrowed to this moment, this woman, these impossible words. "Not coming," he repeated slowly, as if saying it might change the meaning. Clara's chin lifted, and despite her obvious exhaustion and dishevelment, she managed to look regal. "She married a banker in Philadelphia 2 months ago, a Mr. Cornelius Ashford, if you must know. She sent me to deliver her regrets and to return this." She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small leather pouch. The coins inside clinked with a sound like 30 pieces of silver. "The money you sent for her passage." She insisted it be returned in full. Ethan stared at the pouch, but made no move to take it. His mind struggled to reorganize itself around this new reality. 6 months of letters. 6 months of plans. The room with its window overlooking the valley. The blue curtains that weren't yet sewn, the wildflowers dying on his porch. "She sent you," he said slowly, 3,000 miles to tell me she married someone else." Something flickered in Clara's eyes. Sympathy, perhaps, though it was quickly banished. "Not exactly." "I was coming west anyway. I'm a dressmaker by trade, and I intend to establish a shop here in Pine Creek. Adelaide thought it would be, convenient if I delivered her message in person." Convenient. The word tasted like ash in his mouth. Behind Clara, he could see faces beginning to gather. Mrs. Morrison from the general store, Tom Bradley from the saloon, others drawn by the commotion and the delicious scent of scandal. By noon, everyone in Pine Creek would know that Ethan Calloway's mail-order bride had jilted him for a Philadelphia banker. "Mr. Calloway," Clara's voice softened slightly, though her posture remained straight as a rifle barrel. "I realize this is unexpected, but if you'll direct me to the nearest lodging house, I'll be on my way, and you can adjust to your circumstances." "Lodging house?" Sam Wheeler let out a harsh laugh. "Miss, the closest thing we got to a lodging house is May's boarding house, and she's full up with railroad surveyors until Christmas." Clara's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing a flash of genuine worry beneath. "Then perhaps someone has a room to rent?" "You got money for rent?" Sam asked, not unkindly. "After losing your trunks and all?" The silence that followed told Ethan everything he needed to know. Clara Whitmore, for all her fire and dignity, was stranded in Pine Creek with nothing but the clothes on her back and whatever traveling money she'd managed to keep on her person during the robbery attempt. "There weren't any road agents, were there?" Ethan asked suddenly, the pieces falling into place. Sam had the grace to look embarrassed. "Well, not exactly agents, per se. More like that fool Jennings boy trying to impress his friends. Fired a shot in the air, spooked the horses, and we tipped into a gulch. No one was hurt. But the luggage is scattered across half of Montana. Clara finished bitterly. Yes, we've established that. Ethan found himself studying her more closely. Her dress, though dusty and disheveled, was well made. Better made than anything he'd seen in Pine Creek. The stitching was precise, decorative without being ostentatious, and the fabric, despite its current state, was quality wool that would have cost a pretty penny even back east. She'd made it herself, he realized, and that realization sparked something unexpected. Respect. You said you're a dressmaker, he said. Her chin lifted again, that defensive pride that he was beginning to recognize as her armor against the world. I am. Trained in Philadelphia under Madame Beaumont herself. I have had letters of recommendation and samples of my work in my trunks. And you came out here alone to start a business? Is that so impossible to believe? The fire was back in her voice. Women own businesses, Mr. Calloway, even way out here in your wilderness. I've made my own way since I was 16, and I'll continue to do so, lost trunks or no. 16. That meant she'd been on her own for, he estimated her age at maybe 25 or 26, which meant nearly a decade of independence. No wonder she carried herself like she was ready to take on the world. She'd been doing exactly that for years. The crowd around them had grown larger, and Ethan could feel their eyes like brands on his back. He could walk away now, leave Clara Whitmore to figure out her own problems, and nurse his wounded pride in private. It would be the sensible thing to do, the expected thing. But something about the way she stood there, fierce and proud despite having lost everything, called to a part of him he'd thought dormant. She reminded him of the wild horses that sometimes came down from the mountains, beautiful, untamed, and absolutely unwilling to surrender their freedom without a fight. Miss Whitmore, he heard himself saying, my ranch is 3 miles outside of town. I've got a spare room, newly built, actually, and you're welcome to use it until you can make other arrangements. The murmur that ran through the crowd was predictable. An unmarried woman staying at an unmarried man's ranch? The scandal would feed Pine Creek's gossip mill for months. Clara's eyes narrowed. I don't accept charity, Mr. Calloway. It's not charity. You can cook and keep house in exchange for room and board. Call it employment if that suits your pride better. I'm a dressmaker, not a domestic servant. And Pine Creek needs a dressmaker more than I need a housekeeper, Ethan countered. But unless you plan to set up shop in the street, you need somewhere to stay while you establish yourself. I'm offering you that chance. She studied him for a long moment, and he had the unsettling feeling she was seeing straight through to his soul, cataloging his strengths and weaknesses like she might assess fabric for a garment. There would need to be rules, she said finally. Proprieties observed. I won't have my reputation destroyed before I even open my shop. Agreed. Mrs. Patterson lives close enough to serve as chaperone when needed. She's been trying to marry me off for years. She'll be thrilled to have another project. Was that a smile tugging at the corner of Clara's mouth? If so, it was gone before he could be certain. And when I've earned enough to rent my own space? Then you'll be free to leave whenever you choose. I'm not looking to trap anyone, Miss Whitmore. I've had enough of unwilling women for one lifetime. The bitterness in his voice surprised him, but Clara merely nodded as if she understood perfectly. Perhaps she did. Any woman who'd been making her own way since 16 had probably heard her share of promises from men who thought they could cage her. Then I accept your offer of employment, Mr. Calloway. She held out her hand like a man would, ready to shake on the deal. After a moment's hesitation, Ethan took it. Her hand was smaller than his, but her grip was firm, and calluses on her fingers told of countless hours with needle and thread. This was a woman who worked for what she had, who built rather than simply existed. My wagon's at the blacksmith's, he said, releasing her hand and trying to ignore the strange warmth that lingered where their skin had touched. We can head out whenever you're ready. I'm ready now, Clara said, then paused. Though I should perhaps retrieve what's left of my belongings from the stage. What was left turned out to be a single carpet bag that had been wedged under a seat, containing what looked like a few personal items and a leather portfolio that she clutched like it contained gold. Her entire life, reduced to what she could carry in 2 hands. As Ethan helped her onto the wagon seat, she accepted his hand with obvious reluctance. He caught himself wondering what kind of courage it took for a woman to travel 3,000 miles alone, lose everything, and still stand tall enough to negotiate terms rather than accept charity. Adelaide Thornton would have wept. Adelaide Thornton would have needed rescuing. Clara Whitmore looked like she could rescue herself and possibly half the territory while she was at it. "Before we go," Clara said as he gathered the reins, "you should know that I'm not Adelaide. I don't do quiet, I don't do submissive, and I certainly don't do grateful simpering. If that's what you're hoping to eventually get from this arrangement, you're going to be disappointed." Ethan found himself almost smiling, the first genuine urge to smile he'd felt since seeing that too small dust cloud on the horizon. "Miss Whitmore, I've been disappointed once already today. I don't think you could manage worse if you tried. Don't challenge me, Mr. Calloway. You have no idea what I'm capable of." This time he did smile, just a slight upturn of his lips that felt rusty from disuse. "I'm beginning to suspect that's true." As they drove out of Pine Creek, the townspeople watching their departure with undisguised fascination, Ethan found himself reassessing everything he'd thought he wanted. A quiet wife, a peaceful home, a predictable life. These had seemed like worthy goals just an hour ago. Now, sitting beside a woman who radiated energy like a barely banked fire, he wondered if perhaps he'd been selling himself short. The road to the ranch stretched out before them, rutted and rough from the recent rains. Clara gripped the seat as they bounced over a particularly deep groove, but she didn't complain. Instead, she was taking in the landscape with those sharp green eyes, cataloging and calculating. He could almost see her mind working, planning her next move, her next 5 moves. "It's beautiful," she said suddenly, gesturing toward the mountains that rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "Harsh, but beautiful. That's Montana for you. She'll freeze you in winter, burn you in summer, and test you every day in between. But if you can survive her moods, she'll give you a life worth living." Clara turned to look at him, and something in her expression had shifted. "You love it here." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "I do. Came out here 8 years ago with nothing but a horse and determination. Built my ranch from scratch, fought off claim jumpers, and survived 2 bad winters. This land and I have an understanding now. And you wanted to share that with Adelaide." The name sat between them like an unwelcome guest. Ethan's hands tightened on the reins. "I wanted to share it with someone. Adelaide was convenient." "Convenient." Clara repeated the word with the same distaste he'd felt earlier. "Is that what passes for romance in Montana?" "Romance is a luxury for people with options, Miss Whitmore. Out here we deal in practicalities." "How terribly sad." The judgment in her voice sparked his temper. "And I suppose you're an expert on romance? Is that why you're here alone, starting over with nothing?" The moment the words left his mouth, he regretted them. Claire's face went pale, then flushed with anger, but underneath both reactions, he caught a glimpse of genuine hurt. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "That was uncalled for." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I was engaged once, to a man who promised me the world and delivered nothing but lies. He took my savings, my trust, and very nearly my ability to believe in anything good. So no, Mr. Calloway, I'm not an expert on romance, but I do know that settling for convenient is just another kind of prison, and I've served my time." The pain in her voice was carefully hidden, but unmistakable to someone who'd learned to read the signs of wounded creatures. Ethan had seen it in horses that had been broke too hard, in cattle separated from the herd, that wary watchfulness that came from having trust betrayed. "I'm sorry," he said again, and meant it this time. "Seems we've both been disappointed by people who promised more than they delivered." Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment the armor she wore cracked just enough for him to see the woman underneath. Strong, yes, but also vulnerable, carrying wounds that hadn't quite healed. "Perhaps that's why fate threw us together," she said with a bitter smile. "Two disappointed souls in the middle of nowhere, trying to make sense of plans that fell apart. Fate?" Ethan guided the horses around a rough patch in the road. "I didn't take you for someone who believed in fate." "I don't, usually. But what else would you call it when I lose everything I own on the same day you lose the bride you ordered? Either it's fate, or God has a very peculiar sense of humor." Despite everything, Ethan found himself chuckling. Reverend Morrison would have opinions about that statement. Reverend Morrison has opinions about everything, from what I gathered during the 5 minutes I was in town. He seemed particularly interested in informing me that proper ladies don't travel unaccompanied. Let me guess, you informed him right back about something. I may have mentioned that improper ladies seem to have much more interesting lives. She paused. He didn't care for that observation. This time Ethan's laugh was fuller, surprising them both. No, I imagine he didn't. The Reverend has very fixed ideas about how the world should work, and yet he arranged your correspondence with Adelaide. How very modern of him. He saw it as bringing civilization to the frontier. Adelaide was supposed to be, He stopped, uncertain how to finish without insulting Clara. Everything I'm not? Clara supplied. Quiet, biddable, grateful for the opportunity to transform your bachelor establishment into a proper home. Something like that. Well, Mr. Calloway, I'm afraid you're stuck with the opposite. I'm loud when something needs saying, stubborn as a mule when I know I'm right, and the only thing I'm grateful for is the opportunity to prove myself. If you want someone to arrange your doilies and smile sweetly while pouring tea, you'd better send me back to town right now. Ethan considered her words as they crested a small rise. Below them, his ranch spread out in the valley. The main house with its new addition, the barn he'd raised with his neighbor's help, the corral where his horses moved like liquid shadows in the morning light. It wasn't the largest spread in the territory, but it was his, earned with sweat and determination. I don't own any doilies, he said finally, and I drink coffee, not tea. Small mercies, Clara murmured, but she was studying his ranch with those calculating eyes again. You built all this yourself? With help from neighbors when needed. That's how it works out here. We help each other because there's no one else to do it. And they'll all know by sunset that you've brought home a woman who isn't your bride. They'll know before sunset, Ethan corrected. Tom Bradley was in that crowd, and he gossips worse than any woman when he's had a few drinks. By the time the saloon opens tonight, everyone in the valley will know that Ethan Calloway got jilted and took in his almost bride's cousin out of Christian charity. Christian charity, Clara repeated with a laugh that held no humor. Is that what we're calling it? Would you prefer temporary business arrangement? I'd prefer the truth, whatever that might be. The truth. Ethan wasn't entirely sure what the truth was anymore. An hour ago, the truth was that he was waiting for a bride he'd never met. Now the truth was that he was bringing home a woman who made him feel more in 30 minutes than Adelaide's letters had made him feel in 6 months. It was unsettling, inappropriate, and absolutely the last thing he needed. The truth, he said carefully, is that you need help, and I'm in a position to provide it. The truth is that I built that room for someone who isn't coming, and it might as well serve a purpose. The truth is that Pine Creek could use a good dressmaker, and I'd rather see you succeed than watch you struggle just to prove a point. Clara was quiet for a moment, processing his words. And what do you get out of it, Mr. Calloway? Besides the scandal of housing an unmarried woman, I get to avoid the pitying looks every time I go to town. Nothing folks love more than feeling sorry for someone, and a jilted groom is about as pitiful as it gets. But a man who's providing employment to a respectable businesswoman, that's different. That's practical. So we're both using each other to avoid pity. How noble. Never claimed to be noble, Miss Whitmore, just practical. They were approaching the ranch now, and Ethan could see his foreman, Jake Thompson, emerging from the barn with barely concealed curiosity written across his weathered face. This would be the first test. If Jake accepted the situation, the other hands would follow suit. If not, Clara's reputation would be ruined before she even unpacked her single carpet bag. Jake, Ethan called out as they pulled up to the house. This is Miss Whitmore. She'll be staying in the new room while she sets up her dressmaking business in town. She'll also be helping with the household management in exchange for room and board. Jake's eyes darted between them, clearly trying to reconcile this fire-haired woman with the blonde bride Ethan had described. But Jake was nothing if not adaptable. You had to be to survive as a black foreman in Montana, and he simply touched his hat brim. Ma'am, he said politely, welcome to the Double C Ranch. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, ma'am, Jake Thompson. Clara descended from the wagon with more grace than Ethan would have expected after their bumpy ride, and extended her hand to Jake just as she had to Ethan earlier. Jake looked surprised but shook it firmly. "Mr. Thompson, I'm pleased to meet you. I hope my presence won't disrupt the ranch's operations." "No disruption at all, ma'am. Though if you're planning on cooking, might want to know that the boys are used to pretty simple fare, beans and beef mostly." "I can manage beans and beef, Mr. Thompson, though I might occasionally attempt something more adventurous, if that won't cause a revolt." Was that a smile on Jake's usually stoic face? "Ma'am, anything that ain't burnt or raw is adventurous by our standards." "Then we should get along splendidly." Ethan watched this exchange with interest. Clara had none of Adelaide's promised gentle refinement, but she had something else. An ability to meet people where they were, to treat them as equals regardless of station. Jake, who'd been wary of the incoming bride. Eastern ladies don't always take kindly to colored foremen, he'd warned, was already relaxing. "I'll show you to your room," Ethan said, grabbing Clara's carpet bag before she could protest. "Jake, could you have someone bring water for washing? The stagecoach adventure left Miss Whitmore's belongings scattered across the territory." "Already heard about that from Sam's boy," Jake said. "He rode in while you were gone, looking for help to retrieve the luggage. I sent a couple of the boys with him." Clara's face lit up with the first genuine smile Ethan had seen from her. "Oh, thank goodness. My sewing supplies were in those trunks, and without them—" She stopped herself, but Ethan could fill in the blanks. Without them, she had no way to earn a living, no way to prove herself, no way to maintain her independence. The trunks weren't just luggage, they were her entire future. "They'll find what they can," Jake assured her. "The boys are good trackers." As Jake headed back to the barn, Ethan led Clara into the house. He'd tried to tidy up that morning in preparation for Adelaide's arrival, but now, seeing it through Clara's eyes, he was acutely aware of how bachelor rough it still was. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, no touches of softness anywhere, just functional furniture and the bare necessities of life. "It's solid," Clara said, running her hand along the doorframe. "Well built, but not exactly welcoming." She turned to look at him. "Mr. Calloway, I've slept in train stations and boarding houses where the rats were the size of cats. Solid and clean is more welcoming than you might think." He led her down the short hallway to the new room, suddenly nervous. He'd built this space for Adelaide based on what he'd imagined a woman would want. Now, faced with an actual woman, and such a different woman than he'd expected, he wondered if he'd gotten it all wrong. The room was simple but bright, with that window overlooking the valley he'd been so proud of. The bed was new, ordered from the catalog, with a real mattress instead of straw ticking. There was a washstand with a porcelain basin and pitcher, a small wardrobe, and a rocking chair he'd imagined Adelaide sitting in while doing needlework. Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment, taking it all in. When she finally entered, she went straight to the window, gazing out at the view of mountains and meadowland. "It's perfect," she said softly, and there was something in her voice that made Ethan's chest tighten. "I haven't had my own room in a very long time." "The door locks from the inside, Wolt," he said, feeling the need to establish boundaries. "And I'll be sleeping in the main room, not my bedroom, until we can arrange for Mrs. Patterson to come stay." Clara turned from the window, and her expression was unreadable. "That's not necessary." "I trust you, Mr. Calloway." "It's not about trust. It's about reputation, yours specifically. If you're going to open a business in Pine Creek, you need to be above reproach. One whisper of impropriety and the respectable ladies won't patronize your shop. And the non-respectable ladies don't generally have money for custom dressmaking." Clara sighed. "You're right, of course, though it seems unfair that my entire future depends on whether or not Mrs. Grundy approves of my sleeping arrangements." "Mrs. Grundy?" "A character from a play. She represents all the gossiping busybodies who police society's morals while having none of their own. Ah, we have plenty of those in Pine Creek. Mrs. Morrison at the general store could give your Mrs. Grundy a run for her money." "The Reverend's wife?" She seemed quite interested in my marital status during our brief encounter. "She's interested in everyone's marital status. Considers it her Christian duty to see everyone properly paired off." He paused. "She's going to have opinions about this arrangement." "Let her." I've dealt with worse than small-town gossips. There was steel in her voice, and Ethan found himself believing her. This woman who'd lost everything but remained standing, who'd negotiated terms instead of accepting charity, who'd traveled 3,000 miles alone, she could handle a few gossiping townspeople. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Jake's voice called out, "Water for washing, and the boys found some of the ladies' trunks." Clara practically flew to the door, her dignity forgotten in her eagerness. Two of the ranch hands stood there with water buckets and, blessed miracle, 3 travel trunks that looked battered but intact. "Oh, thank heaven!" Clara pressed her hands to her chest. Is everything?" "Looks like they stayed closed, ma'am," one of the hands said, "though they took quite a tumble. Might be some damage to the contents. I don't care if everything's in pieces, as long as it's there." She turned to Ethan, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I can work with pieces. It's having nothing that's impossible." The ranch hands carried the trunks into her room while Jake supervised, and Clara hovered like a mother hen, anxious but trying not to show it. When everything was installed and the men had left, she immediately knelt beside the largest trunk, working the locks with shaking fingers. "I'll leave you to get settled," Ethan said, but Clara had already lifted the lid and was pulling out fabric and supplies, checking each item like a soldier inspecting weapons. "My sewing machine," she breathed, lifting out a carefully wrapped bundle. "Oh, thank God it survived." Ethan found himself lingering in the doorway, caught by the transformation in her. The armor was completely gone now, replaced by pure joy as she discovered each salvaged treasure. Scissors, thread, patterns, bolts of fabric, she greeted each like an old friend. "This silk is ruined," she murmured, fingering a water-stained fabric. "But I can salvage parts of it, and this wool. Oh, this beautiful wool. It's perfect." She looked up at him, and her smile was radiant. "I can work, Mr. Calloway. I can actually work. Did you think I wouldn't let you?" "No, I mean, without these, I had no proof of my skills, no samples to show potential customers, no way to demonstrate that I'm more than just talk." She stood, holding a partially finished dress that even Ethan could see was expertly made. This was to be my showpiece, my proof that I trained under Madame Beaumont. And Madame Beaumont is only the finest dressmaker in Philadelphia. She dressed the governor's wife, the mayor's daughters. She took me on as an apprentice when I was 16, fresh off the streets and desperate for honest work. Fresh off the streets. The phrase hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken stories. Ethan wanted to ask, wanted to understand how a woman like Clara had ended up on the streets at 16, but the way she clutched that dress told him now wasn't the time. "I'll let you settle in," he said again, and this time he meant it. "Supper's usually at 6, nothing fancy, but you're welcome to join us, or I can bring something to your room if you prefer." "I'll join you," Clara said firmly. "If I'm going to be here, even temporarily, I won't hide in my room like a shameful secret." "Fair enough." "The hands eat in the bunkhouse, so it'll just be you, me, and Jake. He usually eats with me since he's foreman." Clara nodded, already turning back to her trunks. "Mr. Calloway? Thank you. For the room, the opportunity, all of it. I know this isn't what you planned for today." "No," Ethan agreed, pausing at her doorway. "It's not. But then seems like plans have a way of falling apart lately. Might as well see where the pieces land." He left her there, surrounded by the salvaged remains of her life, and went to make his own adjustments. The blue fabric he'd bought for curtains still sat on his bureau, a reminder of the quiet wife who was never coming. On impulse, he grabbed it and returned to Clara's room, knocking on the door frame. "Thought you might could use this," he said, holding out the fabric. "For curtains or whatever else. It's just going to waste otherwise." Clara took the fabric, her fingers immediately assessing the quality. "This is good cotton. Excellent weight for curtains." She looked up at him. Adelaide was going to make these? That was the plan. "Plans," Clara said, with that bitter smile again. "Yes, we've both learned about those today, haven't we?" She set the fabric aside carefully. "I'll make your curtains, Mr. Calloway. It's the least I can do." "You don't owe me anything." "No, but I pay my debts anyway. Besides," She held up the fabric to the window, gauging the light through it. "This room needs curtains. It's too exposed otherwise." Too exposed. Yes, that summed up how Ethan felt, like all his careful plans and protections had been stripped away, leaving him vulnerable to whatever storm Clara Whitmore was bringing into his life. Because she was a storm, he was certain of that. Not the gentle rain Adelaide had promised to be, but something wilder, more dangerous, more alive. As he headed to the barn to check on the afternoon's work, Ethan caught himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, a storm was exactly what his too-quiet life needed. The thought should have worried him more than it did. The evening sun cast long shadows through the kitchen window as Clara surveyed the sparse contents of Ethan's pantry. Beans, salt pork, flour, coffee, and not much else stared back at her like a challenge waiting to be met. She rolled up her sleeves, the familiar gesture bringing back memories of countless kitchens where she'd proven herself useful enough to earn a meal or a night's shelter during those harsh years after leaving Philadelphia. "You don't have to cook," Ethan said from the doorway, making her jump slightly. She hadn't heard him come in from the barn. "Jake usually handles the evening meal." "And where's Mr. Thompson now?" Clara asked, already knowing the answer from the way Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Dealing with a fence issue in the south pasture. But he left everything ready." "Mr. Calloway," Clara interrupted, turning to face him fully. "I've been cooking since I was 12 years old. I may not be the bride you ordered, but I'm certainly capable of preparing a meal without supervision." Something flickered in his eyes at the mention of Adelaide, but he merely nodded. "Just don't feel obligated. You've had a long day." "We've both had a long day," Clara corrected, already reaching for an apron hanging on a nearby hook. It was far too large for her, clearly meant for Jake's broader frame, but she cinched it tight and set to work. "Besides, keeping busy helps me think, and I have a great deal to think about." Ethan lingered in the doorway, and she could feel him watching as she moved efficiently around the unfamiliar kitchen, locating pots and pans, testing the heat of the stove. Such as how to convince the good ladies of Pine Creek that they need custom dressmaking when ready-made clothes are becoming so readily available. Such as how to build a reputation in a town that will always see me as the woman who showed up instead of Ethan Calloway's bride. Such as... She stopped herself, realizing she was revealing more than intended. "Such as," he prompted, and there was something gentle in his voice that made her want to continue. "Such as why you're being so kind to someone who brought you nothing but bad news and complication." She kept her back to him, focusing on slicing salt pork with more concentration than the task required. "Maybe I recognize a fellow survivor when I see one." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Claire's hand stilled on the knife. "Is that what we are? Survivors? Out here, that's all any of us are. The land doesn't care about your past or your plans. It only cares if you're strong enough to last another day." She turned to look at him then, really look at him. The late afternoon light caught the planes of his face, highlighting the weather-worn lines around his eyes, the small scar on his jaw she hadn't noticed before. He looked like a man who'd been tested by life, and had come through harder, but unbroken. "Adelaide would have hated it here," Clara said suddenly, surprising herself with the observation. Ethan's expression darkened. "You didn't know Adelaide was going to jilt me when you agreed to come?" "No." The vehemence of her response surprised them both. "No, I thought I was coming to witness a wedding. She told me she was having second thoughts, but I assumed it was just nerves. It wasn't until the night before I left that she told me about Mr. Ashford and begged me to deliver her message." Clara turned back to her cooking, shame heating her cheeks. "I should have refused, but I'd already spent everything I had on the journey, and she offered to pay my way. I'm not proud of it, but I needed to leave Philadelphia, and this was my only chance." "Why did you need to leave?" The question she'd been dreading. Clara focused on rendering the salt pork, watching the fat sizzle and pop in the pan. "That man I mentioned, the one I was engaged to? He didn't just take my savings and trust. He destroyed my reputation. Made sure everyone in Philadelphia society knew that Clara Whitmore was a fallen woman, damaged goods, not fit for respectable company. But you said you worked for this Madame Beaumont, who had to let me go when the scandal broke. She couldn't afford to have her reputation tainted by association. She was kind about it, gave me excellent references for opportunities in other cities, But the message was clear. Philadelphia was closed to me. The only sound in the kitchen was the crackling of pork fat. Clara waited for Ethan's response, for the judgment or pity that always came when people learned of her disgrace. Instead, she heard a chair scrape across the floor as he sat down at the table. What was his name? The quiet fury in Ethan's voice made her turn around. Why does it matter? Because if he ever shows his face in Montana, I want to know who I'm throwing off my property. Despite everything, Clara felt her lips twitch toward a smile. Richard Blackwood, and he's far too fond of city comforts to ever venture this far west. Richard Blackwood, Ethan repeated as if committing it to memory. Sounds like the kind of name that belongs to a man who's never done an honest day's work in his life. Your assessment is remarkably accurate. Clara turned back to the stove, adding beans to the rendered pork fat. He was handsome, charming, and completely without conscience. I was young, foolish, and desperate to believe someone could love me. It's an old story, really, hardly worth retelling. How young? 22, old enough to know better. And now? 26, and I definitely know better. She heard him shift in his chair. 4 years is a long time to carry that weight. It's not weight anymore? It's armor. Richard Blackwood taught me valuable lessons about trust and the price of believing pretty words. I should probably thank him. Should you? Clara added water to the beans, then turned to face Ethan again. Without him, I'd probably be married to some Philadelphia clerk, hosting tea parties and slowly dying of boredom. Instead, I'm in Montana, cooking beans in a stranger's kitchen, preparing to build my own business. Which life sounds better to you? When you put it that way, the beans win every time. She was surprised by the humor in his voice, and even more surprised by her own responding smile. They're not just beans. I found some dried herbs hanging in the pantry, and there's molasses in the back of your cupboard. They won't be fancy, but they'll be better than plain. Jake's going to think he's died and gone to heaven. He complains about his own cooking constantly, but never lets anyone else take over. Well, he's not here to protect his kitchen tonight, is he? Clara stirred the pot with perhaps more vigor than necessary. Besides, cooking is a fair trade for shelter. I meant what I said about not accepting charity. It's not charity when you're earning it. Exactly. And speaking of earning things, we need to discuss my plans for the shop. Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching her work. Already? You've been here less than 3 hours. If I wait, I'll lose my nerve. Besides, you need to know what you're getting involved with by helping me. I'm listening. Clara pulled the cornbread she'd managed from his meager supplies out of the oven, pleased that it had risen properly despite the unfamiliar stove. First, I need to visit every respectable woman in Pine Creek. Not to sell, just to introduce myself and assess their needs. That could take weeks. Days if I'm efficient. Then I need a space in town. Nothing fancy, just somewhere with good light and enough room for fitting. The old newspaper office is empty. Hasn't been used since Thompson tried to start the Pine Creek Gazette 2 years ago. What happened to it? Thompson discovered that reporting the news and setting type didn't leave much time for drinking. He chose drinking. Clara filed that information away. Is the printing press still there? Far as I know, why? Because a printing press means a large open room with good windows. Perfect for a dress shop. She placed the cornbread on the table, then returned to stir the beans. Who owns the building? Tom Bradley. He bought it when Thompson couldn't pay his bar tab. The saloon owner. Clara considered this. That could be complicated. Tom's not unreasonable. He's just been waiting for someone who could actually pay rent. And what makes you think I can? Ethan gestured toward the meal she was preparing. Because anyone who can make my kitchen smell this good from beans and salt pork can work miracles. Pine Creek's ladies are going to line up for your services. You haven't even tasted it yet. Don't need to. I've been eating Jake's cooking for 3 years. Trust me, this is already an improvement. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Jake appeared in the doorway, dust-covered and weary. He stopped short at the sight of Clara at the stove. Miss Whitmore, you didn't need to— It's done and ready, Mr. Thompson. I hope you don't mind that I invaded your kitchen. Jake looked between Clara and Ethan, clearly trying to read the situation. My kitchen? Well, Mr. Calloway informed me you're the usual cook, so I'm assuming you've claimed it as your territory. A slow smile spread across Jake's face. Ma'am, anyone who wants to take over cooking duties is welcome to claim whatever territory they want. That smell alone is worth a dozen invaded kitchens. Clara found herself genuinely smiling as she served up the meal. The three of them sat at the table, and for a moment, an awkward silence descended. This was probably where Adelaide would have said grace, would have brought some Eastern refinement to the rough table. Clara simply picked up her fork and started eating, letting the men follow suit. Sweet mercy, Jake breathed after his first bite. What did you do to these beans? A little of this, a little of that. Nothing special. It's special if you've been eating my cooking, Jake insisted, already reaching for seconds. Ethan, if this lady wants to leave, you'd better chain her to the stove. Jake, Ethan's voice held warning, but Clara laughed. No chains necessary, Mr. Thompson. I'll be here until I can afford my own place, and I prefer cooking to being idle. Speaking of which, Ethan said, Clara wants to look at the old newspaper office for her shop. Good choice, Jake nodded. Plenty of space, good location. Right on Main Street where all the ladies pass by on their shopping trips. You know the town well? Clara asked. Been here almost as long as Ethan. We came west together, actually. Clara looked between the two men, noting the easy companionship that spoke of years of shared history. You've known each other that long. Jake saved my life in Kansas, Ethan said matter-of-factly. Seemed only right to return the favor by making him work on my ranch. Some favor, Jake snorted. Working dawn to dusk in all weather, dealing with ornery cattle and even more ornery cowboys. You love it, Ethan countered. Maybe I do. Jake turned to Clara. But if you're really planning to take over the cooking, I might love it more. The easy banter continued through the meal, and Clara found herself relaxing for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. These men didn't care about her past, her scandal, her failures. They cared that she could cook and hold her own in conversation. It was refreshing and terrifying in equal measure. After supper, Jake excused himself to check on the hands, leaving Clara and Ethan alone with the dishes. She stood to clear the table, but Ethan stopped her with a gesture. You cooked. I'll clean. That's not how it works. It's how it works in my house. Clara sat back down, watching as he efficiently cleared the table and heated water for washing. Did Adelaide know you were this progressive in your thinking? Adelaide knew what I told her in letters, which I'm beginning to realize wasn't much of substance. What did you tell her? Ethan was quiet for a moment, his hands busy with the dishes. I told her about the ranch, the land, the house I was building. I told her about Pine Creek and its potential for growth. I told her about the life she could expect as a rancher's wife. But not about yourself. What was there to tell? I work hard. I keep my word. I don't drink to excess or gamble. That seemed like enough. Clara stood and picked up a dish towel, ignoring his look of protest as she began drying the dishes he'd washed. That's a resume, not a person. It's what she needed to know. Is it? She was coming 3,000 miles to marry you, and all she knew was that you were reliable. What else should I have told her? That I sometimes stand on my porch at dawn just to watch the light change on the mountains? That I read Shakespeare by lamplight when I can't sleep? That I once spent 3 days tracking a wounded wolf just to put it out of its misery because I couldn't stand the thought of its suffering? What good would any of that have done? Clara's hands stilled on the plate she was drying. This was the first glimpse she'd had of the man beneath the practical rancher exterior, and it made her chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. It would have told her who you really are, she said softly. And would that have made her stay? The bitterness was back in his voice, and Clara chose her next words carefully. No, but it might have made her brave enough to tell you the truth sooner. Ethan turned to look at her, his hands still in the soapy water. You think she was a coward? I think she was scared. There's a difference. Is there? Cowardice is knowing what's right and choosing not to do it. Fear is being human. Adelaide was scared of disappointing you, scared of the unknown, scared of making a mistake. So when a safer option presented itself, she took it. Wouldn't you have? Ethan considered this as he returned to washing. I came out here with nothing but fear. Fear of staying in Illinois and becoming my father. Fear of dying in a coal mine. Fear of never amounting to anything. So no, I wouldn't have taken the safer option. Because you're brave? Because I was more afraid of standing still than moving forward. Clara understood that bone deep. It was the same fear that had driven her onto that westbound train, the fear that staying in Philadelphia meant slowly suffocating under the weight of her disgrace. They finished the dishes in companionable silence, and then Ethan showed her around the rest of the house, pointing out where things were kept, explaining the daily routine. The tour ended at his bedroom door, which he gestured to but didn't open. This will be off limits, of course. I'll move my necessary things to the main room tonight. Mr. Calloway. It's not negotiable, Clara. Your reputation matters more than my comfort. The use of her first name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. You called me Clara. He looked surprised, as if he hadn't realized. I apologize. Miss Whitmore. No, it's fine. Actually, it's better. If we're going to be living in the same house, even temporarily, the formality seems silly. Then you should call me Ethan. Ethan. She tested the name, liked how it felt. All right, Ethan. But you're not sleeping in the main room. That's ridiculous. It's necessary. It's martyrdom. Look, we're both adults. We both know nothing inappropriate is going to happen. You stay in your room, I'll stay in mine, and if Mrs. Grundy has opinions about it, she can keep them to herself. And when the good ladies of Pine Creek refuse to patronize your shop because of the scandal, Clara lifted her chin in that defiant gesture he was beginning to recognize. Then I'll dress the not-so-good ladies and probably make more money. Respectability is overrated, Ethan. I've been respectable, and I've been ruined. And frankly, ruined is more honest. You don't mean that. Don't I? When I was respectable, I had to smile and simper and pretend that Richard's wandering hands were romantic rather than presumptuous. I had to pretend that his promises meant something, that being chosen by him was an honor rather than a trap. Now that I'm ruined, I can speak my mind, refuse unwanted advances, and build my own life without needing anyone's permission. Tell me which sounds better. Ethan leaned against the wall, studying her with those intense dark eyes. You're not what I expected when I woke up this morning. No, I imagine not. You expected Adelaide, quiet, dutiful Adelaide who would have made your house a home and never challenged a single thing you said. Actually, I'm beginning to think Adelaide wouldn't have lasted a week out here. Oh? Montana winters are brutal. The wind cuts through you like a knife, and sometimes we're snowed in for weeks at a time. You have to be tough to survive that, tough in ways that have nothing to do with physical strength. And you think I'm tough? I think you got on a train alone, traveled 3,000 miles to deliver bad news to a stranger, lost everything you owned, and still managed to cook dinner and plan your business strategy. Yeah, Clara, I think you're tough. The way he said her name with a kind of rough admiration made her stomach flutter in a way it hadn't in years. This was dangerous territory, this mutual recognition of strength. She'd come here to start over, not to complicate another man's life with her messy history. I should check on my trunks, she said, stepping back from whatever was building between them. I need to assess what can be salvaged and what's ruined. Of course. He moved aside to let her pass. If you need anything, I'll ask. She retreated to her room, closing the door firmly behind her and leaning against it for a moment. What was she doing? She'd been here less than a day, and already she was cooking his meals, arguing about his sleeping arrangements, and feeling things she had no business feeling for a man who'd been expecting to marry another woman this very morning. The trunks waited for her like old friends, and she threw herself into the familiar work of sorting and assessing. The water damage was worse than she'd initially thought. Several bolts of fabric were beyond saving, and some of her paper patterns were illegible. But her sewing machine was intact, her scissors and needles were fine, and most importantly, the showcase pieces she'd made to demonstrate her skills had survived. She held up a burgundy silk evening gown she'd spent 3 months perfecting, every stitch a testament to Madame Beaumont's training. This dress alone could establish her reputation if she could find the right woman to wear it. But who in Pine Creek would need such a gown? A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Clara? Mrs. Patterson is here. She opened the door to find Ethan standing with an elderly woman whose sharp eyes were already cataloging every detail of Clara's appearance, her room, and the obvious sleeping arrangements. "So," Mrs. Patterson said without preamble, "you're the cousin. I'm Clara Whitmore, yes. And you're staying here, alone, with Ethan. I'm employed here, Mrs. Patterson, as housekeeper and cook, in exchange for room and board while I establish my dressmaking business." Mrs. Patterson pushed past Clara into the room, her gaze landing on the trunks and their spilled contents. "Dressmaking, you say?" "Yes, ma'am. I trained under Madame Beaumont in Philadelphia. That got the older woman's attention." "The Madame Beaumont? Who dressed Governor Hartranft's wife?" "You know of her?" "Girl, I wasn't always a frontier widow. I had a life before Montana, and I still read the fashion papers when I can get them." She fingered the burgundy silk with obvious appreciation. "This your work?" "Yes, ma'am." Mrs. Patterson examined the dress with an expert eye, checking seams, evaluating the drape, testing the quality of the stitching. Finally, she nodded. "You'll do." "I'll do?" "For Pine Creek's dressmaker. Lord knows we need someone with actual skill. Martha Bradley's been trying to pass herself off as a seamstress, but her hems are crooked and her buttonholes are a disgrace." Clara felt a spark of hope. "Then you think there's a market for custom dressmaking?" "Girl, there are 3 weddings planned for next spring. The Cattlemen's Association is having their annual ball in December, and Judge Harrison's wife is desperate for someone who can let out her gowns without making it obvious she's gained weight. You'll have more work than you can handle." "That's wonderful news." Now, Mrs. Patterson turned her sharp gaze on Ethan, who'd been standing quietly in the doorway. "About these living arrangements." "They're temporary," Ethan said quickly, "just until Clara can afford her own place." "And I'm supposed to believe that nothing improper is happening under this roof?" "Yes," Clara said firmly, meeting the older woman's gaze without flinching. "Because nothing improper is happening or will happen. I've had quite enough of impropriety in my life, Mrs. Patterson. I came here to start over, not to repeat old mistakes." Something in her tone must have conveyed the truth of it, because Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly. "You've had troubles back east." It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. "Yes, which is why I need this fresh start to work. I can't afford another scandal." "Then you'll need a chaperone, someone respectable to vouch for your character. Would you?" "I'll come by every morning for breakfast and stay through lunch. That should satisfy the worst of the gossips. But," she held up a warning finger, "you'll need to be seen at church, both of you. Together, but not together, if you understand my meaning." "I understand." "And you'll need to join the Ladies' Aid Society. They meet Thursday afternoons at the church." Clara suppressed a groan. She'd hoped to escape the tyranny of ladies' societies by coming west, but apparently they were universal. "She'll be there," Ethan said, and Clara shot him a look that promised retribution. "Good." Mrs. Patterson moved toward the door, then paused. "That burgundy silk. Judge Harrison's wife would look stunning in it. You might want to pay her a call once you're settled." After she left, Clara sank onto her bed, suddenly exhausted. "Is she always like that?" "Always. But she's also the most influential woman in Pine Creek. If she approves of you, everyone else will fall in line. And she approves. She didn't tell you to leave town immediately, so yes, I'd say she approves." Clara laughed, surprising herself with how genuine it sounded. "The bar for approval is set pretty low out here. We take what we can get." Ethan lingered in the doorway, seeming reluctant to leave. "You did well with her." "I told the truth. It's easier than keeping track of lies." "Speaking of truth," he hesitated, then continued, "I should tell you that people are going to talk. About us, about this arrangement, about Adelaide. It's going to be uncomfortable." "Ethan," Clara stood and faced him squarely, "I've been gossiped about by Philadelphia's finest. I've had my name dragged through mud so thick I thought I'd never get clean. A little Montana talk doesn't scare me. It should. Small towns can be cruel to women who don't fit their expectations." "Then it's a good thing I stopped trying to fit anyone's expectations years ago." They stood there, 2 feet apart, but separated by so much more than distance, by propriety, by circumstance, by the ghost of a woman who'd chosen safety over adventure. Clara could see something in Ethan's eyes, a recognition perhaps, or maybe just loneliness calling to loneliness. Whatever it was, she couldn't afford to acknowledge it. Not now, maybe not ever. Good night, Ethan. Good night, Clara. She closed the door between them, but it didn't stop her from hearing his footsteps move away, or from wondering what would have happened if Adelaide had actually come, if Clara had never stepped off that stagecoach with fire in her voice and defiance in her heart. The next morning arrived with a shock of cold air and the sound of horses in the yard. Clara dressed quickly in her most practical dress, a dark blue wool that had survived the trunk disaster relatively unscathed, and made her way to the kitchen. The sun was barely up, but Ethan was already gone, his coffee cup the only sign he'd been there at all. She had bacon frying and biscuits in the oven when Jake appeared, looking pleased to find breakfast already underway. "Morning, Miss Clara. You're up early." "Old habits. Besides, I wanted to prove yesterday wasn't a fluke. Trust me, after years of my cooking, the boys would forgive you just about anything as long as you keep feeding them like this." The boys, as it turned out, were the 6 ranch hands who worked the Double C. They filed in for breakfast with the cautious curiosity of men who'd heard about the woman staying at the boss's house, but hadn't quite believed it. Clara served them without fuss, ignoring their stares and whispered comments, and by the time they'd finished their second helping of biscuits and gravy, she'd apparently passed some unspoken test. "Ma'am," the oldest of them, a grizzled cowboy named Red, tipped his hat to her. "That was the finest breakfast I've had since my mama passed. You ever get tired of the big house? There's 6 men here who'd be happy to marry you just for your cooking." "I'll keep that in mind," Clara said dryly, already clearing plates. "Though I should warn you, I have ambitions beyond the kitchen." "Heard you're planning to open a dress shop," another hand piped up. "My sister's getting married come spring. Might be she'd like to talk to you about a wedding dress." And just like that, Clara had her first potential customer. Mrs. Patterson arrived just as Clara was finishing the breakfast cleanup, her sharp eyes taking in the spotless kitchen and the lingering aroma of fresh biscuits with obvious approval. "Well," she announced, settling herself at the table like a queen taking her throne, "at least you can cook." That's more than Adelaide Thornton could claim, from what her letters suggested. Clara paused in wiping down the stove. "You read her letters?" Reverend Morrison's wife has a tendency to share information she considers pertinent to the moral well-being of the community. Adelaide's complete ignorance of basic household skills was, apparently, quite pertinent. And yet, everyone seemed eager for her arrival. A pretty face and gentle manners can compensate for a great deal of incompetence, especially in a town starved for femininity. Mrs. Patterson's gaze sharpened. "You, on the other hand, have neither the pretty face nor the gentle manners, but you can actually do things. That makes you far more valuable, in my estimation." Clara wasn't sure whether to be insulted or complimented. "I've never been accused of having gentle manners, that's certain." "Good. Gentle manners are for women who can afford to be decorative. You and I, Miss Whitmore, must be useful." The older woman pulled out her knitting, clearly settling in for the morning. "Now, tell me about this dressmaking business of yours." As Clara explained her plans, she found Mrs. Patterson to be a surprisingly astute advisor. The older woman knew every family in Pine Creek, their financial situations, their social ambitions, and most importantly, their clothing needs. "Martha Harrison, the judge's wife. She'll be your key," Mrs. Patterson said, her needles clicking rhythmically. "She sets the social tone for the entire county. If she wears one of your creations to the cattleman's ball, you'll have more orders than you can handle. The burgundy silk dress might work for her, if I can alter it properly. She's taller than you, broader in the shoulders. You'll need to be clever with the alterations. I've reconstructed dresses from paintings before. This will be simpler than that." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose. "From paintings?" A wealthy client in Philadelphia wanted to recreate a gown worn by Marie Antoinette. I had nothing but a portrait to work from. "And did you succeed?" "She wore it to the governor's mansion and caused such a sensation that I had 3 more requests for historical recreations within a week." "Then why did you leave?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Clara focused on folding dish towels, keeping her hands busy while she chose her words. Sometimes success in one place means failure in another. My professional reputation was flourishing, but my personal reputation, well, that's a different story. A man, I suppose. Isn't it always? No, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. Sometimes it's our own foolishness, sometimes it's bad luck, and sometimes it's simply the price of being female in a world run by men. But yes, often it's a man. Ethan chose that moment to enter through the back door, bringing with him the scent of hay and horses and morning air. He stopped short at the sight of Mrs. Patterson, then recovered quickly. "Morning, Mrs. Patterson. I see you've started your chaperoning duties. Someone needs to preserve what's left of propriety in this house." She looked him up and down with the critical eye of a woman who'd raised 4 sons. "You need a haircut." "I need a lot of things, but a haircut isn't high on the list." "It should be. You're escorting Miss Whitmore to church on Sunday, and you'll not embarrass her by looking like a wild mountain man." "I'm escorting her?" "Of course." "She can't arrive alone. That would suggest she has no protection. But you can't arrive together. That would suggest impropriety. You'll arrive at the same time by coincidence and sit in the same general area, but not together." Clara and Ethan exchanged glances, and she could see her own amusement reflected in his eyes. "The logistics of propriety are quite complex," Clara observed. "They are indeed," Mrs. Patterson agreed without irony. "Master them, or be mastered by gossip. Your choice." Ethan poured himself coffee from the pot Clara had kept warm. "Speaking of gossip, Tom Bradley wants to meet with you about the newspaper building." "Already?" Clara felt her heart skip. "But I haven't even—" "Word travels fast in Pine Creek. He heard you were looking for space and wants to make a deal before someone else snatches you up." "Someone else?" "Mrs. Morrison offered the back room of the general store," Ethan said, trying and failing to hide a smile. "Apparently she feels it's her Christian duty to help you establish yourself properly." "How generous," Clara said dryly, imagining being under Mrs. Morrison's constant supervision. "But I think the newspaper building would be preferable." "Thought you might say that. Tom's willing to meet this afternoon if you're interested." "I'll need to bring examples of my work." "Then we'll load them in the wagon. Jake can drive you." "You'll drive her," Mrs. Patterson interrupted. "It's only proper that her employer handles business negotiations on her behalf." "I can negotiate for myself," Clara protested. "Of course you can. But Tom Bradley's more likely to give you a fair deal if Ethan's there. Men respect other men's business interests in ways they don't always respect women's." It galled Clara to admit the older woman was right, but she'd learned long ago to choose her battles. "Fine, but I do the talking." "Wouldn't dream of interfering," Ethan said, but there was something in his tone that made her suspicious. The morning passed quickly with Mrs. Patterson's steady stream of advice and observations. Clara learned more about Pine Creek's social structure in 3 hours than she would have discovered on her own in 3 months. By the time the older woman left after lunch, a simple but hearty stew that earned another nod of approval, Clara felt both educated and exhausted. "She's like a force of nature," Clara said as they watched Mrs. Patterson's buggy disappear down the road. "She's trying to help," Ethan said, "in her own overbearing way." "I know, and I appreciate it. It's just, I came here to escape all this. The social rules, the proper behavior, the constant scrutiny. No escaping it, I'm afraid. Just different rules in different places." Clara turned to look at him. "Do you ever get tired of it? The expectations?" "Every day. But fighting them takes more energy than meeting them, most of the time." "Is that why you wanted a mail-order bride? To meet expectations?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, leaning against the porch rail. "Partly. Also partly because I was lonely, and partly because the ranch needed a woman's touch. And now I have a temporary housekeeper with a sharp tongue and ambitious plans. Not what I expected, but—" He trailed off. "But what?" "But maybe expectations are overrated." The weight of his gaze made Clara's skin warm, and she stepped back, breaking whatever spell was building between them. "We should go see Mr. Bradley." "Right. I'll get the wagon ready." 20 minutes later, they were heading into Pine Creek, Clara's salvage showcase pieces carefully wrapped in the back of the wagon. She'd changed into her best surviving day dress, a deep green wool that Madame Beaumont had said brought out her eyes. Not that she was trying to impress anyone. This was business, nothing more. The newspaper building sat on Main Street between the barber shop and the land office. It was bigger than Clara had expected, with large windows across the front that would indeed provide excellent light. Through the dusty glass, she could see the abandoned printing press and stacks of what looked like old newspapers. Tom Bradley met them at the door, key in hand and an appraising look on his weathered face. He was younger than Clara had expected, maybe 35, with the kind of careful grooming that suggested he considered himself quite the catch for some lucky lady. "Miss Whitmore," he said, taking her hand and holding it a moment too long. "I've heard so much about you already." "All terrible, I'm sure," Clara said, extracting her hand firmly. "On the contrary. I heard you survived a stagecoach robbery and still managed to cook the best breakfast the Double C boys have ever eaten. That speaks to a certain resilience." "Miss Whitmore is interested in the space, Tom," Ethan interjected, his tone carrying a warning that made Tom step back slightly. "Why don't you show us around?" The building was perfect. The main room where the printing press sat would make an ideal showroom and fitting area. There was a smaller back room that could serve as a workshop, and even a tiny apartment upstairs that, while currently full of old newspapers and mouse droppings, could eventually become living quarters. "How much?" Clara asked, already mentally arranging her workspace. Tom named a figure that made her wince. It was fair for the space, but more than she could afford with her limited funds. "That's for the whole building, including the upstairs." "I could start with just the main floor." "Or," Tom interrupted, moving closer than strictly necessary, "we could work out an arrangement. Perhaps you could provide services in exchange for reduced rent." The suggestive tone in his voice was unmistakable. Clara felt Ethan stiffen beside her, but she didn't need defending. She'd handled men like Tom Bradley before. "What kind of services did you have in mind, Mr. Bradley?" she asked sweetly. Tom's smile widened, mistaking her tone for interest. "Well, a man in my position needs to look his best. Perhaps custom shirts, tailored trousers." "I see. And what makes you think I sew men's clothing? A talented seamstress like yourself surely can handle anything." "You're right, I can." Clara stepped closer to him, close enough that he could probably smell her lavender soap. "I could make you shirts so fine that every man in Pine Creek would be jealous. Trousers that fit so perfectly, every woman would notice." Tom's eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Exactly what I had in mind." "Excellent. My rates for men's clothing are double those for women's wear, given the additional complexity and the need for absolute precision in measurements." She pulled out a small notebook from her pocket and began calculating. "For a complete wardrobe, say 5 shirts and 3 pairs of trousers, that would be, roughly 3 months' rent at your asking price." Tom's smile faltered. 3 months? "Oh, did I not mention? Men's tailoring requires special materials. I'd need to order fabric from San Francisco, possibly even Chicago. And of course, multiple fittings would be necessary. Very close, meticulous fittings." She let her gaze travel slowly down his form, as if measuring him. "I'd need to ensure every single inch was perfect." Tom actually gulped, and beside her she heard Ethan make a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. "Or," Clara continued, stepping back and becoming all business again, "I could pay you half the asking price in cash now, and the other half in services, specifically 2 dresses for your mother and sister for the cattleman's ball." "My mother and sister?" "I believe Mrs. Bradley mentioned to Mrs. Patterson that she had nothing suitable to wear, and your sister is hoping to catch the eye of the youngest Henderson boy. Is she not?" Tom looked shocked that she knew this information. "How did you— Women talk, Mr. Bradley, and a dressmaker who doesn't listen doesn't last long." Clara pulled out her carefully saved money, counting out bills. "This is what I can pay now. Your mother and sister will have gowns that will make them the envy of every woman at that ball, and you'll have a respectable tenant who will improve your property and pay regular rent after the first 2 months. Do we have a deal?" Tom looked at the money, then at Clara. then at Ethan, who was watching him with an expression that suggested Tom had better make the right decision. "Deal," he said finally, handing over the keys. "But those dresses better be spectacular. Mr. Bradley, by the time I'm done with them, your mother and sister won't just attend the ball. They'll own it." As they left the building, keys in Clara's possession and a receipt in her pocket, Ethan finally spoke.
"That was manipulative? I was going to say impressive. It can be both." Clara clutched the keys tightly, hardly believing she'd actually done it. "I have a shop." "I actually have a shop." "You do. Though I have to ask, how did you know about his mother and sister?" "Mrs. Patterson, of course. She spent 20 minutes this morning detailing the clothing disasters of every prominent family in Pine Creek." The Bradley women's unfortunate fashion choices featured prominently. Ethan shook his head, smiling. "You've been here 2 days, and you're already playing the social game better than people who've lived here for years. It's not a game. It's survival. And I learned long ago that information is the best currency a woman can have." They spent the rest of the afternoon moving Clara's salvaged supplies into the building. Ethan helped her carry in the trunks while she began planning the space, her excitement building with each decision. The cutting table would go here, the fitting area there, the display of finished pieces along this wall where the light was best. "You're going to need furniture," Ethan observed, looking around the empty space. "I'll manage with what I have for now. Once I start earning money, there's furniture in my barn, left over from when I built the house. Nothing fancy, but serviceable." Clara looked at him suspiciously. "Why do I feel like you're always offering me things?" "Maybe because you're always too proud to ask for what you need." "Pride is all I have left, Ethan." "No," he said quietly, "it's not." The intensity in his voice made her stop arranging fabric and really look at him. He was standing by the window, the afternoon light casting shadows across his face, and there was something in his expression that made her heart race in a way it hadn't in years. "Ethan, you have talent," he continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "You have determination. You have the ability to turn disaster into opportunity. Pride is just the armor you wear to protect all the rest." "And what's wrong with armor?" "Nothing, as long as you remember to take it off occasionally." "Is that what you've done? Taken off your armor?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe. Or maybe having someone see through it makes wearing it pointless." The air between them crackled with possibility, with the recognition of two damaged souls finding something unexpected in each other. Clara knew she should step back, make a joke, do something to break this dangerous tension. Instead, she found herself moving closer. "This is a bad idea," she said softly. "Terrible," he agreed, not moving away. "We barely know each other." "True." "And you were expecting to marry someone else just yesterday." "Also true." "And I'm a disaster when it comes to romantic entanglements." "That might be the least true thing you've said since you arrived." She was close enough now to see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, to smell the leather and soap scent of him. "Ethan, I can't." The door burst open, making them spring apart like guilty teenagers. Tom Bradley stood there with his mother and sister in tow, both women eyeing Clara with barely concealed curiosity and skepticism. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Bradley said, her tone suggesting she'd already reached several unfavorable conclusions. "Tom says you'll be making our ball gowns." Clara straightened, pulling her professional demeanor around her like a shield. "Indeed, Mrs. Bradley. I was just discussing with Mr. Calloway the arrangement of the fitting area. Please come in. Let me show you some examples of my work." For the next hour, Clara was in her element, discussing fabrics and styles, taking measurements, sketching quick designs that made both Bradley women gasp with delight. She carefully guided them toward choices that would flatter their figures while still being appropriate for Pine Creek society. By the time they left, both women were practically glowing with anticipation. 2 weeks? Mrs. Bradley confirmed at the door. "You can really have them done in 2 weeks." "Absolutely. Though I'll need you for fittings every few days." "Whatever you need, dear. Oh, Martha Harrison is going to be green with envy." After they left, Clara sagged against the cutting table. 2 ball gowns in 2 weeks. What was I thinking?"
You were thinking like a businesswoman, Ethan said from where he'd been quietly observing. Strike while the iron's hot. Or burn yourself trying. She looked around the space, calculating what she'd need. I should get back to the ranch. I have work to do. Clara, please, she interrupted, not looking at him. Let's just not. Whatever almost happened earlier, it can't happen. I can't afford the distraction, and you can't afford the complication. And if I said complications might be worth it. She did look at him then, and the vulnerability in his eyes almost undid her resolve. Then I'd say you're still reeling from Adelaide's rejection, and I'm a convenient replacement. That's not fair to either of us. You're not a replacement for anyone. No? Then what am I? He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, softly, you're the first real thing that's happened to me in years. The words hung between them, too honest to ignore, too dangerous to acknowledge. Clara picked up her sewing box, needing something to hold on to. Real doesn't mean right, she said finally. And we both know this, whatever this is, isn't right. Not now, maybe not ever. Clara, take me back to the ranch, Ethan, please. The ride back was silent except for the creak of wagon wheels and the distant call of birds heading south for winter. Clara kept her eyes on the mountains, watching the way the late afternoon sun painted them gold and purple. Beautiful, but harsh, just like everything else in Montana. When they arrived at the ranch, Jake was waiting with news that made Clara temporarily forget the tension with Ethan. Riders came by while you were gone, he said. From the Hendricks spread. Seems there's been trouble with rustlers hitting the small ranches north of here. Ethan's entire demeanor changed, becoming all business. How bad? Bad enough. They hit the Miller place last night, took 30 head. Miller tried to stop them and took a bullet for his trouble. Is he alive? Barely. Doc's with him now, but... Jake shook his head. Sheriff's forming a posse. Wants every available man. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. You're going after them? Have to, Ethan said, already moving toward the house to get his guns. If we don't stop them now, they'll hit every ranch in the valley. But she stopped herself. She had no right to protest, no claim on his safety. Be careful. He paused at the door, looking back at her. I will. Jake will stay here with you. You'll be safe. I wasn't worried about me. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, maybe, or something warmer. Then he was gone, returning minutes later with his rifle and a grim expression. Within an hour, he was riding out with 5 of his men, leaving Clara standing on the porch with an anxiety she couldn't quite name. He'll be fine, Jake said quietly beside her. Ethan knows how to handle himself. I'm sure he does. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. How often does this happen? The rustlers, I mean? Often enough. It's the price of civilization being spread so thin out here. Law's trying to keep up, but there's too much territory and not enough badges. Clara watched until the riders disappeared into the gathering dusk, then forced herself to go inside. She had work to do, 2 ball gowns to create from salvaged materials and hope. But as she laid out fabric and sketched designs by lamplight, her mind kept wandering to a man riding through darkness toward danger and the words he'd said that afternoon. You're the first real thing that's happened to me in years. What was she supposed to do with that? How was she supposed to focus on building her business when every interaction with Ethan felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, tempting and terrifying in equal measure? She worked until her eyes burned and her fingers ached, until the first dress was taking shape and the second was planned down to the last button. Only then did she allow herself to stop, to stand at her window and look out at the star-filled sky, wondering if Ethan was looking at the same stars, if he was safe, if he was thinking of her the way she was thinking of him. Fool, she whispered to herself. You're an absolute fool. But even as she said it, even as she tried to rebuild the walls around her heart, she knew it was too late. Ethan Calloway had gotten under her skin in a way Richard Blackwood never had, in a way she'd thought no man ever could again. Not with sweet words or false promises, but with quiet strength and unexpected understanding, with the way he looked at her like she was something precious and dangerous all at once. The sound of a gunshot in the distance made her jump, but Jake appeared immediately. Just someone shooting at coyotes, he assured her. Nothing to worry about. But Clara did worry. Through the long night and into the gray dawn, working on the dresses because stillness would have driven her mad. When the sun finally rose properly, painting the mountains with light, she was sitting at her sewing machine, surrounded by yards of transformed fabric and the remnants of her carefully constructed armor, wondering when exactly she'd started caring about the safety of a man she'd known for less than 3 days. The answer came with the sound of horses in the yard and her own racing heart, somewhere between his first skeptical look at the stagecoach and the moment he'd called her the first real thing in his life. She'd begun to fall. And falling, she knew from experience, usually ended with breaking. But when she saw him dismount, dusty and tired but whole, when his eyes found hers across the yard and something like relief flickered across his face, she thought that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth breaking for. Clara rushed to the porch as Ethan swung down from his horse, his movements stiff with exhaustion. There was blood on his shirt, not much, but enough to make her heart clench with a fear she hadn't expected. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for him before catching herself, aware of the other men watching. "It's nothing, just a graze," but he swayed slightly, and she saw him grip the saddle for support. "Jake, help me get him inside," Clara ordered, abandoning any pretense of propriety. "The rest of you, tend to yourselves. There's food in the kitchen and water heating on the stove." "We got them," Red announced, though his usual jovial manner was subdued. "Got most of the cattle back, too. Miller's going to pull through." "Good," Clara said distractedly, her focus entirely on Ethan as Jake helped him up the porch steps. "That's good." Once inside, Ethan tried to wave them off. "I told you, it's nothing. Bullet barely grazed me." "Then you won't mind me taking a look," Clara said firmly, already reaching for his shirt buttons. "Jake, bring hot water and the medical supplies." "Clara, you don't need to—" "Be quiet." Her fingers worked quickly, efficiently, and she tried not to think about the intimacy of undressing him, even partially. When she peeled back his shirt, she saw the wound, a furrow along his ribs, that was indeed more graze than serious injury, but still bleeding sluggishly. "See? Nothing," Ethan said, but his voice was tight with pain. "Nothing that won't get infected if not properly cleaned," Claire countered, taking the supplies Jake brought. "This is going to sting." It did sting if his sharp intake of breath was any indication, but he stayed still while she cleaned and bandaged the wound. Her hands were steady, even as awareness of his skin under her fingers sent unwanted heat through her body. "You've done this before," he observed, watching her work. "I told you I nursed during the war. Well, after the war, actually, in the hospitals in Philadelphia. That's where I learned that even small wounds can turn deadly if not properly tended." "How old were you?" 14 when I started. The hospitals were desperate for help with all the returning soldiers. 14. He shook his head. "You were just a child." "The war didn't care about age. Neither did the wounded men who needed tending." She finished wrapping the bandage, her fingers lingering perhaps a moment too long on his skin. "There. That should hold, but you need rest. Can't rest. Too much work to do. The work will still be there tomorrow." She finally met his eyes, and the intensity she found there made her breath catch. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse from exhaustion or infection." "Bossy," he murmured, but there was something soft in his voice that made the words sound like an endearment. "Practical," she corrected, stepping back to put some distance between them. "Jake can handle things for one day." As if to prove her point, Ethan swayed again, and this time Clara didn't hesitate to steady him with her hands on his arms. "Bed. Now." "Not arguing," he admitted, which told her more about his exhaustion than any confession would have. She helped him to his bedroom, the first time she'd entered it since arriving. It was sparse, almost monastic, with just a bed, dresser, and single chair. No pictures, no personal touches except for a shelf of well-worn books. Shakespeare, as he'd mentioned, but also poetry, philosophy, and surprisingly a book of fashion plates from 3 years ago. "That was Adelaide's," he said, following her gaze. "She sent it so I'd know what proper ladies were wearing back east." "And did you study it?" "Every page, trying to understand the woman I was going to marry through her clothing preferences." He sat heavily on the bed. "Foolish, really. Not foolish.
hopeful. Clara pulled off his boots, trying to ignore how domestic the action felt. There's nothing wrong with hope. Isn't there? Hope made me believe I could order a wife like a piece of equipment from a catalog. Hope made me think I could build a life with someone I'd never met. Hope also made you offer shelter to a stranger with nothing but attitude and ambition, Clara pointed out, pulling a blanket over him. Hope isn't the problem, Ethan. It's what we hope for that matters. He caught her hand as she turned to leave. What do you hope for, Clara? The question, combined with the warmth of his fingers around hers, nearly undid her carefully maintained composure. Independence, success, a life where my past doesn't define my future. And love? The word hung between them like a challenge. Clara gently extracted her hand from his. Love is a luxury I can't afford. Or a risk you're not willing to take. Both, maybe. Now rest. I'll bring you soup later. She fled the room before he could respond, her heart racing like she'd run a mile. In the kitchen, Jake was waiting with a knowing look that made her flush. He's stubborn, Jake said simply. Always has been. But you handle him well. I don't handle him at all. I just refuse to let him be foolish about his health. Jake's tone suggested he saw right through her protest. That's why you were up all night sewing and watching for his return. I was working on commissions. The fact that I was awake when you returned is pure coincidence. If you say so, Miss Clara. Jake headed for the door, then paused. He's a good man. Better than most. But he's been alone so long he's forgotten how not to be. Adelaide wouldn't have changed that. She'd have just been another kind of alone. You, though, you're different. Jake, I'm not saying anything needs to happen. Just saying that sometimes what we don't plan for turns out to be exactly what we need. After he left, Clara stood in the quiet kitchen, trying to make sense of the last few hours. The fear she'd felt when Ethan rode out, the relief when he returned, the electricity when she'd touched his skin. It all added up to something she wasn't ready to name. She threw herself into cooking, making a rich beef soup that would help Ethan recover his strength. As it simmered, she returned to her sewing, determined to focus on what she could control. The Bradley women's gowns were coming along beautifully. The burgundy silk she'd salvaged was transforming into something even better than the original, and the green wool she'd planned for the younger Miss Bradley would complement her coloring perfectly. A knock at the door interrupted her concentration. Mrs. Patterson entered without waiting for permission, her sharp eyes taking in everything. Clara's disheveled appearance, the medical supplies still on the table, the general air of disruption. Heard there was trouble with rustlers, the older woman said without preamble. Yes. They caught them, though. Mr. Calloway was slightly injured, but is resting now. And you tended him? I have medical experience. I'm sure you do. Mrs. Patterson's tone was dry as dust. And this medical experience required you to be alone with him in his bedroom? Clara's chin lifted. It required me to keep him from bleeding to death from stubbornness, yes. Girl, you're playing with fire. I'm providing medical care to my employer. Nothing more. Mrs. Patterson snorted. If you believe that, you're not as smart as I gave you credit for. That man looks at you like you're water in the desert, and you look at him like he's a puzzle you're dying to solve. You're imagining things. Am I? Then why are your hands shaking? Clara looked down to see that her hands were indeed trembling slightly. She clenched them into fists. Exhaustion. I was up all night working. Working, yes, but not on dresses, I'd wager. You were worried about him. Of course I was worried. If something happened to him, I'd lose my position here. Lord save me from stubborn women who can't admit their own feelings. Mrs. Patterson sat down heavily. Let me tell you something about Ethan Calloway. That man has been emotionally frozen since he arrived here 8 years ago. He works, he builds, he survives, but he doesn't live. Not really. Adelaide wasn't going to change that. She was just going to be furniture in his carefully constructed life. And you think I'm different? I know you are. I've seen him smile more in the past 3 days than in the previous 3 years. You challenge him, provoke him, make him feel things. That's dangerous for a man who spent so long feeling nothing. Clara sank into a chair across from the older woman. It doesn't matter what either of us feels. I can't afford to lose myself in another man, and he can't afford the scandal of involving himself with someone like me. Someone like you? Someone with a past. Someone who's already failed at love once. Mrs. Patterson leaned forward. Girl, everyone has a past. The difference is whether you let it define your future. And as for failing at love, that wasn't love. Love doesn't lie, cheat, or destroy. What you had with that Blackwood fellow was manipulation dressed up in pretty words. And what makes you think things with Ethan would be different? Because Ethan Calloway doesn't know how to be anything but honest. It's both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. He couldn't lie to you if he tried, couldn't manipulate if his life depended on it. If he says something, he means it. If he makes a promise, he keeps it. You're very invested in this for someone who's supposed to be protecting my reputation. I'm protecting your future. There's a difference. Mrs. Patterson stood. The Ladies' Aid Society meets tomorrow. You'll be there? It wasn't a question. I have work to do. The Bradley gowns will be finished in plenty of time. The meeting is at 2 o'clock. Bring something you've made to show the ladies, and wear your best dress. My best dress is being remade into Mrs. Bradley's ball gown. Then wear your second best, and do something with your hair. That bun makes you look like a schoolmarm. After Mrs. Patterson left, Clara checked on Ethan. He was sleeping deeply, his breathing even. She left the soup warming on the stove and returned to her sewing, but concentration eluded her. Mrs. Patterson's words kept echoing in her mind. He looks at you like you're water in the desert. Was that what she saw in his eyes? Thirst? Need? Or was she projecting her own growing feelings onto him? The afternoon wore on, and she forced herself to focus on the intricate beadwork she was adding to Mrs. Bradley's gown. Each tiny bead had to be placed perfectly, sewn with precise stitches that would hold through hours of dancing. It was meticulous work that usually calmed her mind, but today even this couldn't quiet her tumultuous thoughts. Ethan emerged near sunset, looking better for the rest, but still moving carefully. "Smells good in here," he said, hovering in the kitchen doorway. "Soup. Sit down and I'll get you some." He sat without argument, which told her he was still hurting more than he'd admit. She ladled out a generous bowl and set it before him with fresh bread she'd baked that afternoon. "You've been busy," he observed. "Idle hands and all that." She sat across from him with her own bowl. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got shot and then mothered within an inch of my life." "You were barely grazed, and I was hardly mothering. If you want to see mothering, wait until Mrs. Patterson hears you were up and about instead of resting." He winced. "Please don't tell her." "Your secret's safe with me." She paused. "The men said you caught the rustlers." "Most of them. A few got away, but they won't be back." "We made sure of that." The grimness in his tone made her suspect there was more to the story, but she didn't press. "Miller's going to be all right." "Doc thinks so. Going to be laid up for a while, though. His wife's beside herself. They've got 3 young ones and winter coming on. Maybe the Ladies' Aid Society could help. Mrs. Patterson seems to run it like a military operation. They usually do help with situations like this. Mrs. Miller's proud, though, might not accept charity easily." "I understand that feeling." Clara pushed her soup around with her spoon. "Pride's sometimes all we have to keep us standing. And sometimes pride's what keeps us from reaching for what we really want." The weight in his words made her look up. He was watching her with those intense dark eyes, and she felt that dangerous pull again, stronger than before. "Ethan, I know what you're going to say. It's too soon, too complicated, too everything. But Clara, I've spent 8 years being careful, being practical, being safe. And what did it get me? A mail-order bride who chose someone else, and a life so routine I could sleepwalk through it. And I've spent 4 years rebuilding myself from someone else's destruction. I won't let that happen again. I'm not Richard Blackwood." "No, you're not. You're something potentially worse." His brow furrowed. "Worse?" Richard was easy to see through once the charm wore off. He was a liar, a user, a man who saw women as possessions. You. She stood, needing to move, to put distance between them. "You're genuine. You're honorable. You're the kind of man who could make me forget every hard-learned lesson about protecting my heart." Would that be such a bad thing? Yes. The word came out sharper than intended, because when you realize I'm not what you really want, when the novelty wears off and you remember you wanted a quiet, submissive wife, not a sharp-tongued businesswoman with a scandalous past, I'll be left broken again, and I'm not sure I could survive it a second time. Ethan stood slowly, moving around the table toward her. You think you're a novelty to me? I think I'm convenient. I'm here. I'm different from what you expected, and loneliness makes people see things that aren't really there. You're right about one thing. You are different from what I expected. Adelaide would have been safe, predictable. She would have kept my house and borne my children and never challenged a single thing about my life. And I would have been content with that, the way a man dying of thirst is content with stale water. He was close now, close enough that she could see the exhaustion lines around his eyes, the shadow of beard on his jaw. But then you walked off that stage, all fire and fury, and suddenly contentment seemed like another word for slowly dying. You make me want things I'd given up on wanting. You make me feel things I'd forgotten how to feel. That's just real, he interrupted. It's real, Clara. Maybe the most real thing I've felt in years. And I think you feel it too, no matter how many walls you try to build between us. Clara's heart was racing, her carefully constructed arguments crumbling under the intensity of his gaze. Feeling something doesn't make it right, or safe, or smart. No, it doesn't. But maybe I'm tired of doing what's safe and smart. Maybe I want to do what feels right, even if it's terrifying. He raised his hand slowly, giving her time to step away, and brushed a strand of hair that had escaped from her bun. The gentle touch sent shivers through her entire body. I can't, she whispered, but she didn't move away. Can't or won't? Both. Neither. I don't know. She closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the warring desires to run and to lean into his touch. Ethan, please. I need this job, this chance to build something. If we complicate things, then we'll deal with the complications. His hand dropped, but he didn't step back. I'm not asking you to give up anything, Clara. Not your business, not your independence, not even your carefully guarded heart. I'm just asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, you don't have to do everything alone. The vulnerability in his voice nearly undid her. This strong, capable man who'd built a life from nothing in the harsh Montana territory was standing before her, offering something she'd thought she'd never want again. Partnership, possibility, perhaps even love. I need time, she managed. Time to think, to establish my business, to figure out who I am here. Time I can give you. He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. But Clara? Don't take too long. We've both wasted enough years being afraid. He returned to his chair, finishing his soup as if he hadn't just shaken her entire world. Clara stood frozen for a moment, then fled to her sewing, needing the familiar comfort of needle and thread. They spent the evening in oddly companionable silence, him reading one of his books while she worked on the Bradley gowns. Occasionally their eyes would meet across the lamplight, and each time sent a jolt of electricity through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. When Jake returned from checking on the men, he took one look at them and shook his head. You two are going to drive each other crazy, he muttered, but there was fondness in his voice. The next morning brought new challenges. Clara dressed carefully for the Ladies' Aid Society meeting, choosing her second-best dress, a deep blue wool with black trim that was professional without being ostentatious. She left her hair in its usual bun, defying Mrs. Patterson's advice. She wasn't trying to catch a husband, she was trying to establish a business. Ethan insisted on driving her to town despite her protests about his injury. I need supplies anyway, he said, though she suspected this was an excuse. The church was already full of women when they arrived, their chatter dying as Clara entered. She felt their eyes assessing everything from her dress to her posture to the way Ethan helped her down from the wagon. Ladies, Mrs. Patterson's voice cut through the whispers. This is Miss Clara Whitmore, our new dressmaker. She'll be showing us some of her work today. Clara had brought the partially finished Bradley gowns, and as she displayed them, explaining her techniques and design choices, she could feel the atmosphere in the room shifting from suspicion to interest. That beadwork is exquisite, Judge Harrison's wife said, examining Mrs. Bradley's gown.
I haven't seen work this fine since I was in San Francisco. Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. I trained under Madame Beaumont in Philadelphia. The Madame Beaumont? Another woman leaned forward eagerly. She designed the First Lady's inaugural gown. Actually, that had been Clara's work, though Madame Beaumont had taken the credit. But Clara simply smiled and nodded, letting the women's excitement build. By the end of the meeting, she had 3 more commissions and several requests for consultations. The women seemed to have collectively decided that having a real Eastern-trained dressmaker was worth overlooking her irregular living situation. "Well done," Mrs. Patterson murmured as the meeting broke up. "You've got them eating out of your hand." "I've got them interested in my work." "There's a difference." "Not as much as you'd think." "By the way, Martha Harrison wants to speak with you privately." Judge Harrison's wife was waiting by the church door, her expression unreadable. She was an imposing woman, tall and elegant even in her simple day dress, with the kind of presence that commanded attention. "Miss Whitmore," she began without preamble, "I understand you're staying at the Calloway Ranch." "I'm employed there, yes." "Don't dissemble." "We both know the situation is more complex than that." She studied Clara with sharp eyes. "I knew Adelaide Thornton's aunt in Baltimore, vapid woman with vapid daughters. Adelaide would have been miserable here and made Ethan miserable in the process." Clara blinked at this unexpected statement. "I see? Do you?" "Ethan Calloway is a good man who deserves better than a wife who would have seen him as nothing more than an escape from genteel poverty. You, on the other hand." "I'm not looking to be anyone's wife, Mrs. Harrison." "Aren't you? Then you're either lying or blind. That man looks at you like you hung the moon, and you look at him like he's a mystery you're desperate to solve." She paused. "I'm hosting a dinner party next week. You'll both attend." "Mrs. Harrison, it's not a request. If you're going to be part of this community, you need to be properly introduced. And if there's something developing between you and Ethan, better it happens under the watchful eye of society than in secret."
Secrets have a way of becoming scandals out here. And if I refuse, then I'll have to assume you have something to hide, and I'll advise the other ladies accordingly.
Your business would suffer, I'm afraid. It was blackmail, elegantly delivered, but blackmail nonetheless. Clara recognized the game. She'd played it often enough in Philadelphia. "What time should we arrive?" 7 o'clock. "And Miss Whitmore? Wear something spectacular. I want everyone talking about your dress rather than your circumstances." As Mrs. Harrison swept away, Clara realized she'd just been both threatened and accepted, challenged and supported, all in the span of a few minutes. Montana society, it seemed, was just as complex as its eastern counterpart, just with different rules. Ethan was waiting by the wagon, talking with Tom Bradley. As she approached, she heard Tom saying, "Finest horseflesh in the territory. You should see the stallion." "Clara," Ethan interrupted, clearly relieved by her arrival.
"Ready to go?"
"Actually," Tom interjected, "I was hoping Miss Whitmore might have time to discuss my mother's gown. She had some additional requests." Clara saw through the excuse immediately, but played along. "Of course, Mr. Bradley." "Ethan, why don't you get your supplies? This won't take long." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he nodded and headed toward the general store. Tom immediately stepped closer, his cologne overwhelming in its intensity. "Miss Whitmore." "Clara, I wanted to apologize for my behavior yesterday. I was too forward." "Yes, you were. I'd like to make it up to you. Perhaps dinner? There's a new restaurant that just opened." "Mr. Bradley, I'm flattered, but I'm far too busy with my work to consider social engagements." She kept her tone polite but firm. "Now about your mother's requests." "There aren't any. I just wanted a moment alone with you." He moved even closer. "You must be lonely out at that ranch with just Calloway for company."
"A woman like you deserves better." "A woman like me?" "Sophisticated, talented, beautiful." "Mr. Bradley." "Tom, please." "Mr. Bradley," she repeated firmly, "I'm perfectly content with my current situation. Now, if you'll excuse me—" He caught her arm as she turned to leave. "Don't be too hasty. Calloway's a good man, but he's rough, unsophisticated. You deserve someone who can appreciate your finer qualities." "Like you." Clara gently but firmly extracted her arm. Mr. Bradley, let me be very clear. I am not interested in any romantic entanglements. Not with you, not with anyone. I'm here to build a business, nothing more. Everyone says that at first, but Montana winters are long and cold. You'll want company soon enough. Then I'll get a dog. Good day, Mr. Bradley. She walked away, aware of his eyes following her. The encounter left her feeling unsettled and vaguely dirty, like she needed a bath. Richard had been like that, all surface charm and persistent pressure, never taking no for an answer until it was too late to say no. Ethan was loading supplies into the wagon when she found him. He took one look at her face and frowned. What did Bradley want? Nothing important. Clara. She sighed. He was being persistent. It's handled. Ethan's expression darkened. If he bothers you again, I can handle Tom Bradley. I've handled worse. That doesn't mean you should have to. The protectiveness in his voice warmed something inside her, even as she tried to resist it. We've been invited to dinner at the Harrisons next week. Commanded, really. Martha Harrison doesn't invite, she summons. What does she want? To properly introduce me to society, she says. But I think she's really trying to force us into a more defined relationship. Either we're employer and employee, in which case my staying at your ranch is a temporary business arrangement, or we're something else. And which would you prefer? The question hung in the air between them. Clara busied herself with arranging the supplies in the wagon bed. I don't know, which is the problem. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than before, charged with unspoken possibilities and the weight of decisions yet to be made. Clara kept stealing glances at Ethan, noting how he held the reins despite his injury, the way the afternoon sun caught the silver threads in his dark hair that she hadn't noticed before. You'll need a dress for the Harrison dinner, he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Something that will impress them. I have suitable dresses. No, you need something new. Something that shows them exactly who Clara Whitmore is. She turned to look at him fully. And who is that? A woman who survived scandal and came out stronger. A businesswoman who can transform fabric into art. Someone who doesn't need their approval but will take it on her own terms. That's a lot for one dress to convey. Then it's a good thing you're talented enough to make it happen. The faith in his voice made her throat tight. When had anyone last believed in her abilities so completely? Madame Beaumont had seen her as a useful tool. Richard had seen her as a pretty possession, but Ethan saw her as herself, complete and capable. Back at the ranch, she threw herself into work with renewed energy. The Bradley gowns were nearly complete, needing only final fittings and finishing touches. But Ethan was right. She needed something spectacular for the Harrison dinner, something that would establish her not as the cousin of Ethan's runaway bride or as his controversial house guest, but as Clara Whitmore, dressmaker extraordinaire. She had one bolt of midnight blue silk that had survived the trunk disaster intact, purchased with the last of her Philadelphia savings and intended as her calling card piece. Now, as she unrolled it across her cutting table, she knew exactly what it would become. The house fell into its evening routine, Jake preparing the simple meals since Clara was absorbed in her work, the ranch hands coming in for supper, the comfortable sounds of a working ranch settling for the night. But through it all, Clara was aware of Ethan's presence, the way he moved carefully around his injury, the occasional glance he threw her way when he thought she wasn't looking. It was Jake who finally insisted she stop for the night. You'll ruin your eyes working by lamplight, he said, physically removing the fabric from her hands. Whatever you're making will still be there tomorrow. The Harrison dinner is in 6 days. I have the Bradley final fittings tomorrow, 3 new commissions to start, and somehow I need to create a miracle dress that will establish my reputation once and for all. Then you'll need rest to do it all, Ethan said from his chair by the fire. Come sit. You've been hunched over that table for hours. She wanted to protest, but her back was indeed aching and her fingers were cramped from detailed work. Reluctantly, she moved to the chair across from him, accepting the cup of coffee Jake pressed into her hands. Tell me about the new commissions, Ethan prompted. As she described the requests, a day dress for the banker's wife, a riding habit for the sheriff's daughter, a christening gown for the newest Miller baby, she found herself relaxing, the familiar talk of fabric and design soothing her nerves. The christening gown is a gift from the Ladies' Aid Society, she explained. Since Mr. Miller is still recovering, they wanted to do something special for the family. That's kind of them, and kind of you to rush it. It's the least I can do. Besides, baby clothes are quick to make and use hardly any fabric. I can craft it from the salvaged white silk that was too damaged for anything larger. Jake excused himself to check on something in the barn, leaving them alone with just the crackle of the fire for company. Clara became intensely aware of the intimacy of the moment, just the two of them in the lamplight, sharing the kind of quiet evening that married couples might share. "This isn't what you expected when you answered Adelaide's letters, is it?" she asked softly. "No," Ethan admitted, "but I'm beginning to think what I expected and what I needed were two very different things." "What did you need?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "To wake up. I've been sleepwalking through life for 8 years, going through the motions of living without really feeling anything. Safe in my routines, safe in my solitude, safe in my plans for a convenient marriage to a suitable woman. And now? Now I'm awake. Uncomfortably, inconveniently awake. And it's terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Clara understood that feeling too well. She'd been safe in her anger, safe in her determination to never trust again, safe in her solitary ambitions. But something about this place, these people, this man, was cracking through her carefully constructed walls. "I know what you mean," she admitted. "I came here planning to disappear into my work, to build a business and a life that depended on no one but myself. Instead, I find myself cooking for ranch hands, attending church socials, and preparing for society dinners. It's not what I planned." "Are you sorry?" She considered the question. "No," surprised, challenged, occasionally frustrated, but not sorry, although I could do without Tom Bradley's attention. Ethan's expression darkened. "If he bothers you again, he's harmless, just persistent and misguided. Men like that aren't always harmless." The edge in his voice made her look at him more closely. "You really are worried. You're under my protection while you're here. That means something to me. I'm your employee, not your ward. You're—" He stopped, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "You're more than that, and we both know it." The words hung between them, impossible to take back or ignore. Clara set down her coffee cup, her hands trembling slightly. "Ethan, we can't what? Can't acknowledge what's happening between us. Can't admit that every time we're in the same room it feels like lightning about to strike?" "Yes, exactly that. Because acknowledging it makes it real, and making it real means risking everything I've worked for. Or gaining something worth more than work. Love isn't worth more than independence. I learned that lesson the hard way." "That wasn't love, Clara. Whatever you had with Blackwood, it wasn't love." "How would you know?" The question came out sharper than intended. "Because love doesn't diminish you. It doesn't require you to become less so someone else can feel like more. What he did to you, that was possession, control, manipulation, not love." Clara stood abruptly, needing to move. "And you're an expert on love? The man who is willing to marry a stranger for convenience? No, I'm not an expert. But I know what it feels like to want someone else's happiness more than your own comfort. I know what it's like to see someone's strength and want to support it, not suppress it. I know what it's like to watch you work on your dreams and feel proud rather than threatened." His words hit her like physical blows, each one targeting a wound Richard had left. "Stop." "Why?" "Because it's easier to believe all men are like him? Because it's safer to stay behind your walls than risk being hurt again?" "Yes." She whirled to face him. "Yes to all of that. Because I barely survived it the first time, Ethan. When Richard was done with me, I was hollow, empty. It took 4 years to rebuild myself, and even now there are pieces missing, parts of me I'll never get back." Ethan stood slowly, moving toward her with the careful precision of a man approaching a spooked horse. "What did he take from you?" The gentleness in his voice undid her. "My trust. My faith in my own judgment. My ability to believe that someone could want me without wanting to change me." She felt tears threatening and blinked them back furiously. He made me feel like I was never enough, not pretty enough, not charming enough, not submissive enough. And when I tried to be what he wanted, he despised me for being weak. Clara. Ethan stopped just out of reach, his hands clenched at his sides as if physically restraining himself from touching her. You are enough. More than enough. You're remarkable exactly as you are. Sharp tongue, fierce independence, stubborn pride, and all. You say that now, I'll say it tomorrow and the day after and every day until you believe it. He took one step closer. I'm not asking you to give up anything for me. Not your business, not your independence, not even your protective walls. Keep them all if you need them. Just let me stand beside you while you do. The tears came then, silent and unwanted, sliding down her cheeks before she could stop them. I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to let someone close without losing myself. Then we'll figure it out together. Slowly, carefully. With all the time you need. He pulled out a handkerchief and offered it to her without moving closer, respecting the space she needed. Clara took it, wiping her eyes and trying to regain her composure. This is exactly what I didn't want to happen, she muttered. Crying. Feeling. The admission came out raw and honest. It was easier when I couldn't feel anything but anger and ambition. Easier isn't always better. Spoken like someone who hasn't had their heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. No, spoken like someone who's had his heart frozen for so long he forgot it existed until a fire-haired woman stepped off a stagecoach and reminded him what it meant to be alive. The raw honesty in his voice made her look up at him. In the flickering firelight, she could see the vulnerability he usually kept hidden, the loneliness that matched her own, the hope he was trying so hard not to show. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. He finally closed the distance between them, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness. But maybe being scared together is better than being safe alone. For a moment she leaned into his touch, allowing herself to feel the warmth of his palm, the calluses that spoke of hard work, the tremor that revealed he was as affected as she was. Then the sound of Jake returning broke the spell, and they stepped apart. Storm coming, Jake announced, stomping his boots on the threshold. Can smell it in the air. Might get snow tonight. This early? Clara asked, grateful for the distraction. October snow isn't unusual up here, Ethan explained, his voice almost normal despite what had just passed between them. Usually doesn't stick, but it's a reminder that winter's coming. That night, Clara lay in her bed listening to the wind pick up outside her window, rattling the glass and whistling through the gaps in the walls. True to Jake's prediction, snow began to fall, fat flakes that glowed in the moonlight. She pulled her quilt higher and tried not to think about Ethan just down the hall, probably lying awake as she was, both of them caught in the space between what was safe and what was possible. The next morning brought a world transformed. 6 inches of snow covered everything, turning the ranch into something from a fairy tale. Clara stood at her window, entranced by the way the early sun made everything sparkle. Beautiful, isn't it? Ethan's voice from her doorway made her jump. I didn't hear you knock. Door was open. I was coming to warn you that the kitchen will be cold. Fire went out during the night. She turned to face him, acutely aware that she was still in her nightgown and wrapper. I'll get it started again. Already done. Coffee's ready when you are. He paused, his eyes traveling over her unbound hair that fell past her shoulders. You should wear it down more often. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her flustered and warm despite the chill in the air. She dressed quickly, pinning her hair in its usual severe bun with perhaps more force than necessary. She couldn't afford to be distracted by Ethan's compliments, not with so much work ahead. The Bradley women arrived for their final fitting just after breakfast, brought by Tom, who used the opportunity to linger and make increasingly obvious attempts to gain Clara's attention. She maintained professional distance, focusing entirely on the minute adjustments needed to make the gowns perfect. Oh, Miss Whitmore, the younger Miss Bradley breathed, spinning in front of the mirror Clara had installed. I've never looked so elegant. The dress merely enhances your natural grace, Clara said, pinning the hem with practiced precision. Hold still, please. Tom, look how beautiful your sister is, Mrs. Bradley prompted, but Tom's eyes were fixed on Clara as she knelt to work on the hem. Indeed.
Beauty seems to be in abundance today, he said with what he clearly thought was charm. Ethan, who had been working on ranch accounts at the kitchen table, looked up with a frown. Clara caught his eye and shook her head slightly. She could handle this. Mr. Bradley, if you're not needed for the fitting, perhaps you could wait outside. The ladies need privacy for their final adjustments. Of course. I'll just wait on the porch. After he left, Mrs. Bradley lowered her voice. You know he's quite taken with you. I'm aware. He's a good catch. Owns the saloon, has investments in the railroad coming through. You could do worse. Clara looked up from her pinning. Mrs. Bradley, I'm not looking for a catch, good or otherwise. I'm building a business. Every woman needs a husband eventually. Do they? I seem to be managing quite well without one. The older woman's face reddened.
That's a rather modern attitude, Miss Whitmore. Perhaps, but it's mine nonetheless. Now, let's see about this bustle adjustment. The fitting concluded with both Bradley women delighted with their gowns and Tom finally convinced to take them home after several more unsuccessful attempts to engage Clara in personal conversation. As their buggy pulled away, Ethan emerged from the house. He's not going to give up easily. No, but neither am I. She began gathering her supplies. I need to work on my dress for the Harrison dinner, and I have 3 more appointments this afternoon. You're going to work yourself into exhaustion. I'm going to work myself into success. There's a difference. But by evening, even Clara had to admit she was pushing too hard. Her eyes burned from detailed beadwork, her fingers were pricked raw from thousands of stitches, and her back ached from hunching over her work. When she accidentally sewed a sleeve on backwards, something she hadn't done since her first year as an apprentice, she knew it was time to stop. She found Ethan and Jake in the barn, tending to a mare that was showing signs of colic. Both men looked up as she entered, and she saw Ethan's immediate concern at her appearance. You look dead on your feet, he said bluntly. Thank you for that flattering assessment. She leaned against a stall door, suddenly feeling every hour of lost sleep from the past few days. Is the mare all right? She will be, Jake assured her. Just needs walking and watching. I'll stay with her tonight. You stayed up last night with the storm. Ethan, you're still recovering from your injury. I can take a turn walking her. Both men looked at her in surprise. You know about horses? Ethan asked. I worked in a stable for 6 months when I was 17, room and board in exchange for mucking stalls and exercising the horses. I learned a lot about colic and other ailments. Every time she revealed another piece of her past, Ethan realized how little he truly knew about her journey. How many places did you work between 16 and apprenticing with Madame Beaumont? 14. She said it matter-of-factly, but he heard the weight behind the number. 14 different positions in 2 years, each one teaching me something about survival. Clara, it's in the past. She pushed off from the stall door. Let me help with the mare. I need to do something physical, or I'll go mad from sitting still. They spent the next 2 hours taking turns walking the mare around the barn, the rhythmic movement and quiet companionship soothing after days of intense work and emotional turbulence. Jake finally declared the danger past and sent them both to bed, insisting he'd check on the mare once more before turning in. As they walked back to the house through the snow, Ethan caught Clara's arm when she slipped on an icy patch. He steadied her but didn't immediately let go. Thank you, she said softly. For the mare, I mean. For letting me help. You're part of this ranch now, for as long as you choose to be. That means you're part of everything, the good and the difficult. Part of the ranch. Not part of your life? The question slipped out before she could stop it. Ethan's hand tightened briefly on her arm. You're already part of my life, Clara. The question is whether you want to be. She looked up at him, standing there in the snowy darkness with moonlight silvering his features, and felt something shift inside her chest. Some last wall crumbling, some final resistance weakening. I don't know how to want that without losing myself, she admitted. Then don't. Want it as yourself, entirely yourself. I don't want some reformed version of you, Clara. I want the woman who fights for her dreams, who stands up to Tom Bradley, who walks colicky horses at midnight. All of you or none of you, nothing in between. The next few days blurred together in a frenzy of work. Clara's dress for the Harrison dinner came together like magic under her skilled hands. midnight blue silk that seemed to capture starlight in its folds, with subtle beadwork that caught the light like scattered diamonds. She'd designed it to be elegant but not ostentatious, sophisticated but not above her station. It was a dress that said she belonged without trying too hard to fit in. The morning of the dinner, Mrs. Patterson arrived to help her prepare, bringing an arsenal of hairpins and opinions. "You'll wear your hair up, but softer than usual," the older woman decreed. "And I brought rouge, though Lord knows you probably won't need it with the way you flush every time Ethan walks into a room." "I do not flush. Child, you turn pinker than a spring rose. Now sit still and let me work." As Mrs. Patterson arranged her hair into an elaborate style that was indeed softer than her usual severe bun, Clara found herself nervously fidgeting with the dress laid out on her bed. "Stop fretting. The dress is perfect and you know it. It's not the dress I'm worried about." "No, it's what happens when Ethan sees you in it." Mrs. Patterson's hand stilled for a moment. "That man is already half in love with you, you know? He's infatuated with the idea of me. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I sit, he sees you pretty clearly, flaws, fears, and all, and he's still looking at you like your Christmas morning and summer sunset rolled into one. That's terrifying. Love usually is." "I didn't say anything about love." "You didn't have to." Mrs. Patterson stepped back to survey her handiwork. "There. You look like a woman who could conquer the world, or at least Pine Creek society." Clara looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman looking back. The softer hairstyle revealed the graceful line of her neck, and even in her plain wrapper there was something different about her, something that might have been hope trying to bloom despite her best efforts to suppress it. When she emerged from her room that evening in the midnight dress, Ethan was waiting in the main room dressed in his best suit, clearly recently purchased, as it fit him perfectly and showed no signs of ranch wear. He turned at the sound of her door, and the expression on his face made her heart skip several beats. "Clara." Her name came out like a prayer, soft and reverent. "You're luminous." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. Damn Mrs. Patterson for being right about the flushing. "It's just a dress." "No, it's not just anything. You've transformed yourself into exactly what Pine Creek society needs to see, elegance and strength in equal measure." "You clean up rather well yourself," she managed, trying to deflect from the intensity of his gaze. "Jake insisted on the new suit, said I couldn't escort the most beautiful woman in Montana wearing my church clothes." "Escort? I thought we were merely arriving at the same time by coincidence." Martha Harrison amended her instructions. "Apparently we're to arrive together but maintain appropriate distance during dinner." He offered her his arm. "Shall we navigate these treacherous social waters together?" She took his arm, feeling the solid strength of him through the fine wool. "Together," she agreed, and meant more than just the dinner. The ride to the Harrison house was quiet, but it was the comfortable silence of two people who had moved past the need for constant conversation. Clara was acutely aware of Ethan beside her on the buggy seat, the warm tat of his body blocking the worst of the cold wind, the way he carefully helped her down when they arrived so her dress wouldn't catch on anything. The Harrison house was the finest in Pine Creek, 2 stories of imported lumber with real glass windows, and a wraparound porch that spoke of Eastern influences. Light blazed from every window, and Clara could hear voices and laughter from inside. "Ready?" Ethan asked, his hand briefly covering hers where it rested on his arm. "As ready as one can be for trial by society." "You'll triumph. You always do." His faith in her was both warming and terrifying. Clara lifted her chin, pulled on the armor of confidence she'd learned to wear in Philadelphia's ballrooms, and let him lead her inside. The evening that followed was everything she'd expected and more. Martha Harrison had indeed invited all of Pine Creek's most influential citizens, and Clara found herself the center of attention in ways both subtle and obvious. The women examined her dress with calculating eyes, the men with appreciation that occasionally bordered on inappropriate, and everyone watched her interaction with Ethan like it was a theatrical performance. But Clara had played this game before, in more hostile rooms with higher stakes. She discussed fashion with the banker's wife, railroad investments with Judge Harrison, and the challenges of frontier education with the school teacher. She deflected Tom Bradley's increasingly desperate attempts to monopolize her attention with grace, and managed to make even Mrs. Morrison smile with a carefully placed compliment about her brooch.
"You're doing wonderfully," Ethan murmured during a brief moment when they found themselves alone by the punch bowl. "You've got the meeting out of your hand. I've got them intrigued. There's a difference. Either way, your business is going to thrive." As if to prove his point, 3 more women approached her before dinner to inquire about commissions. By the time they sat down to the meal, Clara seated strategically between the minister's wife and the banker's daughter, far from both Ethan and Tom Bradley. She had a full order book for the next 2 months. The dinner itself was elaborate by frontier standards: roast beef, potatoes and cream sauce, vegetables that must have cost a fortune to import, and a dessert of actual chocolate cake that had everyone exclaiming. Clara ate carefully, mindful of her dress and the dozens of eyes watching her every move. It was after dinner, when the men retired for cigars and the women gathered in the parlor, that the real interrogation began. "So, Miss Whitmore," Martha Harrison began, her tone deceptively casual, "tell us about your time with Madame Beaumont. Such an exclusive establishment." Clara recognized the test. Martha had done her research and was checking if Clara's claims were true. It was indeed exclusive. Madame only took clients by referral, and she only employed seamstresses who could meet her exacting standards. "And you met those standards at what age?" 16, though I wasn't allowed to work on actual client pieces for the first year. Madame believed in thorough training. "Yet you left her employ. Why?" Here it was, the moment she dreaded. Clara could lie, could manufacture some excuse, but she sensed that Martha already knew the truth and was testing her honesty. "I left because my personal reputation was damaged by a man who promised marriage and delivered only humiliation. Madame couldn't afford to keep me on without risking her business." The room went silent. Clara kept her chin high, meeting Martha's gaze directly. "And this man?" "Is in the past, where he belongs. I came west to start fresh, to build something based on my skills rather than my social standing." "And Ethan Calloway? Is he part of this fresh start?" Clara felt every eye in the room focus on her. "Mr. Calloway has been extraordinarily kind in providing employment and shelter while I establish my business. He's a good man who deserves better than gossip and speculation." "That's not an answer to my question." "With respect, Mrs. Harrison, it's the only answer I'm prepared to give. My feelings, whatever they may be, are my own." She expected censure, but instead Martha smiled. "Good. A woman who guards her heart carefully is a woman who values it properly." She turned to the others. "Ladies, I believe we found ourselves a treasure in Miss Whitmore. I propose we ensure her success, don't you?" The shift in atmosphere was palpable. Suddenly, Clara wasn't an interloper to be investigated, but a project to be championed. The women began discussing who else needed dresses, which events were coming up, how to spread word of her skills to the neighboring towns. When the men rejoined them, Ethan's eyes immediately found hers across the room. She saw his quiet question, "Are you all right?" and gave him a slight nod. More than all right, actually. She'd passed the test, won the support she needed, and managed to maintain her dignity in the process. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of conversations and connections. By the time Ethan helped her into the buggy for the ride home, Clara was exhausted but exhilarated. "You conquered them," he said as they pulled away from the Harrison house. "I survived them. Conquest implies I wanted their surrender." "Didn't you?" "I wanted their business." "I got it. The rest is just performance." "Not all of it." She looked at him, his profile silvered by moonlight. "What do you mean?" "When you talked about me, about my kindness, that wasn't performance. That was real." Clara was grateful for the darkness that hid her expression. "Don't read too much into it. Too late. I've been reading into everything you do since you stepped off that stage." "Ethan, I know. You need time. You need to establish yourself. You need to be sure. I understand all of that. But Clara, I also need you to know that I'm already sure. You're not a consolation prize for losing Adelaide. You're not a convenient replacement. You're the woman I want. Complicated past, uncertain future, and all." The words hung in the cold night air, warming Clara more than any fire could. She wanted to respond, wanted to tell him that she was beginning to want him too, but fear still held her tongue.
Instead, she reached over and briefly covered his hand with hers where it held the reins. It wasn't a declaration, but it was a beginning. His fingers turned to squeeze hers gently before she pulled away. When they arrived back at the ranch, Jake was waiting on the porch despite the late hour. His expression immediately put them both on alert. "What's wrong?" Ethan demanded. "Ryder came by an hour ago. There's been a fire at the Brennan Ranch. Barn's gone, along with most of their winter feed." Ethan cursed. "Anyone hurt?" "No, thank the Lord, but Jack's asking for help. Every ranch in the valley is sending what they can spare." "Of course. We'll load up wagons at first light." Ethan turned to Clara. "The Ladies' Aid Society. We'll want to help. I'll speak to Mrs. Patterson in the morning." She watched the transformation in him, from dinner companion to ranch owner, from potential suitor to community leader. This was who he was at his core, a man who showed up when needed, who helped without being asked, who built community through action rather than words. "I'll help load wagons," she offered. "You have commissions to work on. The dresses can wait a day. Neighbors can't." Something shifted in his expression, a softening that had nothing to do with tiredness. "You understand," he said quietly. "You understand what it means to live out here." "I'm learning." That night, despite her exhaustion, Clara lay awake thinking about the evening, Martha Harrison's approval, the flood of new commissions, but mostly about Ethan's words in the buggy. He was sure about her. The thought was terrifying and thrilling in equal measure. She'd come to Montana to disappear, to build a quiet life where her scandal couldn't follow. Instead, she'd found herself at the center of a community, with her business thriving and a man who looked at her like she was everything he'd never known he wanted. The smart thing would be to maintain distance, to focus on her work, to guard her heart. But as she listened to the wind howl outside and thought about tomorrow's work, helping neighbors in need, she wondered if perhaps the smart thing and the right thing weren't always the same.